Chapter 629. Jean Wan watched the man's smiling face. You've actually learned how to show off your love in front of others? Are you Mo Jingshan or not? You actually know how to use such a senseless method. The man lightly curved his lips, revealing a patient and gentle smile that could only be seen in front of her. I don't like to see you being bullied. As a prop that came to your door, aside from showing off my love, I can only destroy this family's foundation in one night. But after all, I was your mother's relative when she was alive. Do you want me to use the most gentle method or the cruelest method to take revenge for you, En? He really switched between gentleness and cruelty so easily. However, if it wasn't because of her mother, Mo Jingshan most likely wouldn't just sit and wait for death. He definitely wouldn't let it go so easily. Jean Wan knew that his words made sense, and it was for her own good. After thinking for a moment, she put on a straight face and slapped his arm as though venting her anger. However, in return, the man smiled indulgently, as though he really liked seeing her acting so awkward and about to explode. Finally, when Jean Wan pushed him again, Mo Jingshan released his hand. However, he directly held her hand and led her out. The two sisters watched as this unbelievably handsome man held Jean Wan's hand and appeared to be very affectionate with her. They stood in the yard silently, but their hearts were filled with all sorts of emotions. Jealousy, unwillingness, and a sense of inferiority surged up. They no longer felt the dark satisfaction they had when they tried to extort Jean Wan's money 2 days ago, nor did they feel the satisfaction of being able to bully the young miss of a wealthy family. They only felt as though everything had been bounced back, and their eyes turned red from the sourness. Seeing that they were really leaving, Jean Wan's aunt rushed over, speaking fawningly. Jean Wan, didn't you say you had a fever last night? If you're not feeling well, don't be in such a hurry to leave. It's too tiring to travel all the way here. Why don't you stay at home for a few more days? Jean Wan's fever had indeed subsided not too long ago, but she did not wish to continue staying here. Do you want to stay? Mo Jingshan's long, slender fingers held Jean Wan's hand in his palm. Jean Wan found that once Mo Jingshan decided to act, his acting skills were really good. Even his every action and tone was like a good husband who was being controlled by his wife. Not only was his money in cards in her hands, but even the way he spoke and the way he cared for her were especially gentle and patient. Even his usual words were changed, perfectly portraying the image of a good husband who only cared about his wife. She said, "No, but Grandma's health is not very good. On the day I accompanied her in the hospital, I found that the medicine she usually takes is cheap fake medicine. She doesn't have enough nutrition. Before we leave, we will buy more medicine and food. After we send them to Grandma, we will leave directly." Hearing Jean Wan's words, her aunt's expression immediately changed. She did not dare to speak and directly retreated to the side, not responding. Of course, she knew what was going on with those cheap, fake medicines. She was the one who bought them. After all, the old lady was already so old. Since many years ago, she could not do anything and could only eat and drink for free. This time, after being hospitalized for a cerebral hemorrhage, she was directly paralyzed and could not take care of herself. Not only did it cost money, but it also required people to take care of her. She also had to buy all sorts of expensive medicines to maintain her life. Those medicines were not cheap, so she simply contacted someone to buy some medicine bottles from the black market. She casually filled them with medicine that could reduce internal heat. After all, they wouldn't go bad, nor would they be poisonous. She did not expect to be discovered by Jean Wan. Jean Wan did not expect her aunt to feel any guilt. For a woman in her 50s like her who would only shout herself hoarse for small benefits, some deep-rooted bad habits would last a lifetime. But sooner or later, she would have her own retribution. It was just that the time had not come. In the past, Jean Wan only needed to hug her and return home from the company on time to cook a meal for her. That was enough to make her obedient. But right now, it was not so easy for Jean Wan to openly gain her favor. Even for someone like Mo Jingshan, who had always planned everything, he rarely admitted that it was difficult. G City was not large. Shenmue drove them to buy things. After driving for about 40 minutes, they arrived at a relatively large pharmacy. Jinwan directly went in to buy medicine. Although her grandmother was not a good person and was clearly biased between her mother and her aunt, even if they could no longer contact each other in the future, she still had to buy these medicines. As for the rest, Jinwan did not plan to care. From buying medicine to buying all sorts of nutrition that the elderly needed, Jinwan finally stopped after filling the entire trunk. In the morning and afternoon, they only ate the food that Shenmue bought from outside. Furthermore, they didn't eat much. By the time they finished shopping, it was already 4:30 p.m. Shenmue parked the car in the parking lot near a shopping mall in G City. He told them to eat first before going back. Anyway, he was only going to deliver some things. He didn't want his family to have dinner with him and asked them to stay. In fact, even if her aunt really wanted to use dinner as an excuse to make them stay, Jinwan would definitely not stay a minute longer in that home with Mo Jingshan. However, since they had already parked near the shopping mall, Jinwan glanced at the restaurants outside. None of them were big, so she chose the one that looked the cleanest. When she alighted from the car with Mo Jingshan, the two walked side by side. As they walked, Jinwan looked at the surroundings and said, "I really didn't expect that one day, Great Boss Missouri would appear in a small city like this. You even have to find a place to eat near a wholesale mall. Mo Jingshan, how do I not look like an ordinary person? Do I have to specially find a gold-plated place to eat? That's not necessarily the case. But it's true that you don't fit in here." In fact, Jinwan did not want to laugh. However, when she saw the ordinary surroundings and the muddy weather, the air was filled with the stench of rotting vegetables from the nearby market, and the suit that Mo Jingshan was wearing, she felt that he must have rushed from Jing City to High City and then from High City to G City. He had been taking care of her and had not changed his clothes for at least 2 days. Although he was still incomparably handsome, it was rare that he did not look as noble and even more down-to-earth. When she spoke, she could not help but laugh. Seeing the woman glance at him, Mo Jingshan's handsome face remained expressionless. He reached over and held the woman in his arms, pressing her head against his chest, forcing her to press against the material of his shirt. He lowered his head and deliberately lowered his voice to say, "I haven't bathed for 2 days. You're very disgusted, N? I don't dare to. I've stayed here for 3 days and haven't bathed. At most, I've wiped myself. Last night, I was drenched in the rain, and until now, I haven't even touched water. If we're going to be dirty, let's be dirty together. There's no need to be disgusted with each other." Jinwan wanted to push the man away, but unexpectedly, he held her tighter. Chapter 630. I heard that although G City is small, it's close to mountains and rivers. A small city with mountains and rivers has its own benefits. There are quite a number of hot spring hotels. Although the decorations can't be compared to Jing City, it's more natural. The man's low chuckle was by her ears. Jinwan could even feel Mo Jingshan's hand gently rubbing against her back. From an outsider's perspective, the two of them were only whispering intimately. However, Jinwan could clearly feel the man's obvious hints. They had already left Jing City, yet he was still thinking about the hot spring hotel. It was not just a hint. Jinwan could clearly feel that the man could tell that her temper had softened today and was no longer going against him. He was taking the opportunity to tease her. She glared at him. However, even though the man was teasing her, as long as her gaze met his, she could see that his calm and deep eyes were filled with her reflection. It was as though all of the jokes and teasing had become incomparably harmonious in an instant. There was not the slightest bit of absurdity. She rolled her eyes at him and directly entered a restaurant in front. Seeing that this woman was unmoved by force or persuasion, Mo Jingshan sighed with a smile. It was just a simple little restaurant, but it was clean and there were quite a few people. After eating, the two of them were in no rush to return. After all, the weather was gloomy, and there would be a storm soon. If they were to leave now, they would encounter a storm on the way back. It was better to wait for the storm to pass and ensure that there were no puddles on the road before leaving. After eating, the sky was still overcast. Seeing that it would rain soon, Mo Jingshan calmly glanced at the sky and softly said, "Should we go back now or wait for the rain to pass?" Jin Wan sat in the restaurant and looked at the weather outside. After thinking for a moment, she lazily said, "Let's go after the rain. The rain won't be light. However, there doesn't seem to be much to look at in G City. We don't know how long the rain will last. There aren't any attractions nearby. Why don't we find a cafe nearby to drink coffee to kill time? Drink less coffee." Jin Wan, these few years, she had indeed drank a lot of coffee. However, Mo Jingshan clearly drank quite a lot as well. When she did not need to stay up late to work, she was indeed not addicted to coffee. However, she could not sit with Mo Jingshan in a crowded restaurant and face a few empty plates for the entire afternoon. "There's a shopping mall here. I'll accompany you." Jin Wan, it was not easy for a man to take the initiative to accompany a woman to go shopping. It was obvious that this man wanted to please her. He probably couldn't think of anything more romantic in such a small place. Even the method was so practical. Jin Wan was also a woman. Although she liked to buy things, she was not particularly keen on shopping, but at this moment, she suddenly wanted to go shopping. Jin Wan glanced at him. "My card is frozen. You know it." Seeing that she was giving him a way out, the man took out his wallet and put it in front of her. "Don't you have mine?" Jin Wan glanced at the black, high-quality leather wallet on the table. After a moment of silence, she said, "My fever only subsided this morning. I can't carry anything. Buy whatever you want, I'll carry the bags." Jin Wan raised her brows, picked up the man's wallet, and directly put it into her bag. She stood up. "Oh, then I'll go shopping." His tone seemed to be very reluctant. Hearing this woman's deliberate tone, Mo Jingshan took another look at her. Jin Wan's expression was calm. She turned and walked directly toward the shopping mall. The man looked at her and smiled slightly. Far away from High City and Jing City, where there were too many businesses, in this small town, he had the rare time and patience to win his wife back. Jin Wan took the man's wallet and walked directly into the shopping mall. She was wearing a pair of sports shoes that she had just changed into in the car. Her steps were light and fast, and her long hair was spread out behind her. As she walked, it danced with her movements. Coupled with her casual and comfortable clothes, she still looked like a young lady who was not even 20 years old. She was young and energetic, but not as flamboyant as she was many years ago. Under the faint restraint was a temperament that had been honed by life experience. The first floor of the shopping mall was mostly filled with cosmetics, jewelry, and watches. There were two shopping malls here. One was G City's wholesale mall, and there were all sorts of things. After entering, most of them were small trinkets that cost several tens of yuan. Even the clothes were not more than 100 yuan, but there were many different styles, and there were many people inside. Next to it was G City's department store. There were not many people, but the quality of the items here was much higher, and there were also some branded items. Jin Wan, on the other hand, did not look down on any of them. After walking one round in the wholesale mall, she strolled around and looked at all kinds of trinkets. She touched this and that, and she liked them very much. After shopping for more than an hour, she finally went to the other department store. Mo Jingshan was probably too good-looking and had attracted the attention of someone in the mall. They tugged at him and asked if he wanted to find a job and if he wanted to be a male model. They said that if he wore branded men's clothing and stood on the first floor for a day, he could earn 300 yuan a day. Jin Wan heard the movements behind her and quickly walked forward with a smile. She did not turn back. On the other hand, before the staff could finish their words, they were frozen by the man's cold and noble aura and did not dare to continue. However, they still muttered softly, 300 yuan a day. That's 9,000 yuan a month. You don't even care about such a high salary? Young people these days really don't care about money. However, the man did not even glance at the staff's work pass. He expressionlessly walked past. Jean Wan had already walked to the side of a jewelry store and was trying on a cute little ring. This was a silver jewelry store. The items were not expensive, but the craftsmanship and design were all exquisite. The price was roughly a few hundred yuan. Mo Jingshan did not look at the price. He only saw Jean Wan wearing the ring on her pinky finger. Does it look good? When Mo Jingshan walked over, Jean Wan raised her hand and waved it at him. Jean Wan's hand was very beautiful and suitable for wearing rings. However, she rarely wore jewelry on her body. The man glanced at it and only noticed one problem. Why is it on your pinky finger? Chapter 631. Jean Wan, what the hell was this? She just wanted to try it on. She didn't say she wanted to buy it. Besides, even if she wanted to wear it on other fingers, it wouldn't fit. Jean Wan was about to speak, but Mo Jingshan's hand had already firmly grasped hers. He took the ring off her little finger, gave her a very unkind look, and threw the ring back to the clerk behind the counter. Seeing the man's expression, Jean Wan pursed her lips. I didn't. Do you have other sizes? The man did not wait for her to speak and turned to ask the shop assistant. Yes, 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 yes. The shop assistant rushed to bring out several similar rings and placed them on the counter one by one. The man picked up a ring that was exactly the same as the one Jean Wan had just chosen and was about to put it on her ring finger. However, Jean Wan quickly withdrew her ring finger and glared at the man resolutely, indicating that she would not allow him to put it on her ring finger so casually. Mo Jingshan paused because of her obvious refusal. However, after thinking about it, although he was not sure about other fingers, the ring on her ring finger could not be worn so carelessly. He had to change it to a better occasion and ring. Thus, he did not insist. After checking the size, he was about to put it on her index finger when the shop assistant spoke up again with a half-joking tone. Sir, you can't put it on your index finger either. Wearing a ring on your index finger implies that you are still single. If there are other men who want to pursue you, they can boldly pursue you. This is tantamount to announcing that you are single and welcoming others to pursue you. Are you trying to make yourself a cuckold? Mo Jingshan, Jean Wan tried hard to hold back her laughter, but the faintly twitching flesh on her cheeks showed how hard it was for her to hold back her laughter. The shop assistant also noticed Jean Wan's action of withdrawing her ring finger and said considerately, if you are passionately in love, you can wear it on your middle finger. This means that the flower is taken and you are passionately in love. Jean Wan wanted to say who was passionately in love with him. It sounded like there was no problem for her to wear it on her little finger. It was quite good. Anyway, she did not have any plans to fall in love. However, this time, the man did not stop. He expressionlessly picked up another ring of the same size and put it on Jean Wan's middle finger. Jean Wan looked at the ring on her middle finger. It was quite pretty. In fact, although silver jewelry was not expensive, the craftsmanship was relatively simple, so it was relatively easy to make all kinds of complicated designs. This was a style that many other jewelry, such as diamond, platinum, or platinum could not make. But she really didn't say that she wanted to buy it. Not bad. After helping her put it on, Mo Jingshan held Jean Wan's soft little hand in his, not intending to let go. At the same time, he appeared to be very satisfied. He said mildly, "It's very beautiful. Do you like it?" Jean Wan, I didn't plan to buy it. I just tried it on. The man acted as if he didn't hear her and turned to the shop assistant. Do you have any other similar sizes? Yes. The shop assistant took out a few more items. They were all listed in front of Jean Wan, and she was dazzled. She felt that all of them were beautiful, but for some reason, she felt that the one she was wearing was the most beautiful. In fact, they were all similar, and the design style was outstanding. You don't like it? The man glanced at the ring on Jean Wan's finger. I like it, but there's no need, I'll take them all. I said there's no need to buy it. I didn't say. The man swept a glance and replied, I think you don't know which one to choose. Why don't you buy them all and wear them every day? Jean Wan, shop assistant. Several minutes later, the shop assistant handed over a bill. Sir, the 6 rings you've chosen cost a total of 1,590 yuan. Mo Jingshan's gaze faltered before landing on Jean Wan's face. Jean Wan once again held back her laughter. She suddenly realized that it was rare to see Boss Missouri in such a distressed state. A man like him might understand everything, but when it came to women's jewelry, he most likely didn't notice that this was a silver jewelry or other jewelry counter. He should have been prepared to spend millions or even tens of millions. Jean Wan raised her hand, waving the rings in front of his eyes. She smiled and said, this is a silver ring. Each one is only 200 to 300 yuan. When the man heard the price, he no longer showed any signs of surprise. He glanced at her again. Are you sure you like it? Jean Wan nodded. Since it wasn't expensive, she could just buy it. The blue diamond that was worth who knew how many billions was still in her hands, and the painting that was worth 600 million was gifted to her just like that. It was rare for her to go shopping, so there was nothing wrong with buying some small trinkets. Seeing that she really liked it, the man held her hand and turned to pay. In a small place like this, he could not casually wave his hand and put it under Boss Mo's name. Instead, he had to go to the cashier to pay in cash or by card. While the shop assistant waited by the counter, she carefully wrapped the rings and placed them into a jewelry bag. At the side, one of the shop assistants muttered softly, they actually bought so many silver rings. They're really simple and unadorned. The shop assistant who had just sold the rings calmly said, don't be so superficial. Just look at that man and young lady's attire. Just a single cufflink from that man's suit would be enough to buy our entire shop. Don't rich people nowadays always say to return to their roots? Maybe it's because there are too many luxurious things, so he's interested in these little crafts on the street. Also, that young lady looks really good wearing it. She's prettier than many of the big diamond rings I've seen. That's true. That man doesn't look like an ordinary person. That young lady doesn't look ordinary either. Furthermore, that man kept asking that young lady if she really liked it. It was because she liked it that he bought it. Why would he care about the price? As long as the person he loves likes it, even jewelry worth hundreds of millions can't compare to a silver ring like this. After shopping for an hour in the department store, Jean Wan could no longer stand Mo Jingshan's attitude of helping her pack whatever she liked. In the end, she dragged him to the fresh supermarket on the basement level. Originally, Jean Wan was tugging on Mo Jingshan's sleeve as they walked. However, when they got off the elevator, Jean Wan suddenly realized that when did he become the one holding her hand? In a public place, Mo Jingshan, who had always been low-key and reserved, actually had a time when he was so persistent about certain things. For example, holding her hand. From the moment she tried on the ring, he naturally held her hand. Now, he naturally held her hand. He really acted as if it was only right and proper. Chapter 632. Not only did he hold her hand the entire time they stepped out of the elevator, he did not even intend to let go when Jean Wan went to pick some fruits. Mo Jingshan, I want to pick some fruits. Jean Wan turned to look at him, her tone filled with impatience. The man lowered his head to look at her hand in his. His tone was calm as he said, which ones do you want? I'll help you pick. I can pick them myself. After buying a few more things, we can go back. I think the rain outside should have stopped by now. Let go of my hand. I'll do it myself. She tried to pull her hand away several times, but the man did not give her the chance. The uncles and aunties selling fruits all looked at them with ambiguous and envious gazes. In the end, Jean Wan was helpless. She picked some fruits with one hand and handed them to the man to carry. Thankfully, Shenmue came in time to help Imo Jingshan carry the rest to the car. Otherwise, no matter how strong Imo Jingshan was, it would not be realistic for him to carry so many things with one hand. Just like that, they were forced to hold hands and buy all sorts of things. As the two walked back to the elevator, Jinwan said, "Don't tell me you plan to hold my hand forever? How long do you think you can hold it for? A lifetime?" Mo Jingshan, N. Jinwan, shameless. Who would want to hold his hand forever? Don't think that just because he carried her out of her grandmother's house and sent her to the hospital in time to take care of her, she didn't fall out with him just because she was grateful to him. She really went with the flow and became his Mrs. Mo. Impossible. Anyway, it was impossible. Absolutely impossible. Jinwan wanted to say this. However, when she tried to pull her hand away again in the elevator, the man held her firmly in his hand and did not let go. At the same time, his other hand held the fruits, vegetables, and fresh fish they bought with her. For some reason, she felt that the down-to-earth and homey boss Missouri was truly a breath of fresh air in the world of presidents. By the time they drove back to her grandmother's house, the storm had stopped. It had been raining for more than an hour. There was a small puddle on the ground, but it was not serious. Jinwan checked the weather forecast in the car and confirmed that there would not be any more rain today. After sending these things back to her grandmother, they could leave. When they returned to her grandmother's home, Shenmue helped carry the things in one by one. Mo Jingshan also carried a few things. However, although Jinwan dared to order Mo Jingshan around, Shenmue did not dare. Seeing his boss carrying the things so diligently without any complaints, he was so frightened that he rushed out and took the things in his hands, saying, "CEO Mo, rest. I'll do it, I'll do it." Her aunt sat in the yard, holding a fly swatter in one hand. She subconsciously swatted it back and forth on a wooden table. She watched as Jinwan and the others brought back all sorts of food, drinks, and medicine. It could be seen that they must have spent quite a lot on this trip. If they really didn't have a card to swipe, they wouldn't have bought so many things. But every time she wanted to ask for money, she raised her eyes to see the man called CEO Mo, the man who claimed to be Jinwan's husband. She hesitated and did not dare to speak up in the end. After Shenmue helped to carry everything in, Jinwan did not plan to stay here anymore. She planned to go in and bid farewell to her grandmother, who was lying on the bed, before leaving. Her grandmother looked at the piles of medicine and food by the bedside. She heard from the young man surnamed Shen that these were all bought by Jinwan. She also heard that Jinwan was going to leave. Her old face was thoughtful when she suddenly heard footsteps. She turned to see Jinwan walking in. "Grandmother, take good care of your body. If you eat these nourishing foods daily, they'll be enough for you for a year. They have a long shelf life, so you can eat them without worry. As for the medicine, they have a shelf life of 2 to 3 years. I bought a lot of them. It shouldn't be a problem for you to take them for 2 to 3 years." Jinwan stood by the bed and did not sit down. Her gaze was calm and indifferent. "I'll take all the things my mother left here with me. I won't have the chance to come back to G City in the future. Take care of yourself." After speaking, she did not look at her grandmother's expression and turned to leave. "Wait a minute, Jinwan." Her grandmother's gaze was stiff as she looked at the pile of things on the floor. Just as Jinwan was about to leave, she suddenly called out to her. "Child, wait a minute. I have something to tell you." Jinwan paused in her footsteps and turned back to look at her. Her grandmother's words were a little rushed. She coughed twice before leaning against the bed. She said weakly, "I won't be able to live for much longer. My body will live as long as I can. I originally wanted to call you back to tell you about your mother, but after seeing you return, I didn't know what to say. I know you don't have any feelings for your grandmother, but you do have a filial heart." Jinwan calmly looked at her. In fact, from the start, she had thought that she might be able to find out something by coming to G City. However, in the few days she had been back, apart from witnessing the weirdness of this family, she had gained nothing. But looking at her grandmother's expression, it seemed like she was finally going to get to the main topic. Jean Wan sat in her grandmother's room for around 40 minutes and did not come out. Shenmu was slightly worried. He sat in the car and said, "Miss Ji only went in to say goodbye. Why hasn't she come out yet?" Mo Jingshan's gaze calmly shifted to the mother and daughter trio in the yard. This meant that Jean Wan was in her grandmother's room. There was only Jean Wan and the old woman who was paralyzed on the bed without anyone's help. It was clear that they were only chatting inside. Nothing else would happen. There's no rush. Wait patiently. The moment Mo Jingshan's words landed, Shenmu turned to look at the two sisters, Song Sisi and Song Kiki. Because they saw that Mo Jingshan did not plan to sit in their home and was waiting in the car outside the yard, the two sisters seemed to be thinking of something. They went in to change their clothes, put on makeup, and did their hair. They then stood in the yard chatting and laughing, as though they were afraid that no one would be able to tell that they were purposely putting on a show for CEO Mo. However, the two sisters were hindered by Mo Jingshan's aura. Even if they wanted to, they did not have the guts to approach him. They could only stand in the yard and attempt to seduce him from afar. Their gazes would occasionally shift toward the car window. However, from the angle of the car window, they could not clearly see where Mo Jingshan was sitting in the car. Thus, their gazes kept shifting back and forth in the direction of the car windows. Yet, Mo Jingshan did not even glance at them. It was as though the yard was filled with filthy things. He could not even be bothered to lift his eyelids in that direction. Chapter 633. When Jean Wan left her grandmother's room, Song Sisi and Song Kiki were already tired from twisting and were resting in the courtyard. They turned to see Jean Wan walking out. The two sisters raised their eyes to look at her, but Jean Wan walked out without looking. Her face was expressionless, and it was impossible to tell what she was feeling. After Jean Wan boarded the car and the high-end black car drove away, the mother and daughter trio sat in the courtyard with dejected expressions because they did not receive a single cent. Jean Wan sat quietly in the car. She kept her eyes out of the window and did not speak. Mo Jingshan saw that she was troubled and did not speak. He gave her time to sort out her emotions. It was not until the car drove toward the main road of G City and moved further away from her so-called grandmother's house that the man's hand landed on the hand she had placed by her leg. He spoke, "You only came out after almost an hour. What did you talk about?" Jean Wan paused and continued to look out the window. "She only spoke, she told me some things about my mother. I haven't figured out my own identity yet, but she threw me a difficult problem." "What problem?" "She said that my mother was not her biological mother. She said that when she was young, she worked for a rich family in Jing City and worked as a servant for a year. Later, she returned to the countryside and gave birth to my aunt. Because she lacked money, she went back to work for that family again. However, something happened to that family. It was similar to the melodramatic stories that only the older generation would have. Anyway, not long after my mother was born, she became an abandoned baby. My grandmother picked my mother up and raised her until she was 10 years old. When she sent her back, she wanted to take the opportunity to ask for some money. However, that family had already moved abroad and couldn't be contacted. At this point, Jean Wan raised her hand to push back the hair hanging over her forehead and said mildly, "She adopted my mother so that she could ask for a few million yuan from that family when they wanted to find the child. However, her hopes were dashed. After that, she no longer had any thoughts about my mother and left her to fend for herself. After my mother graduated from junior high school, she borrowed money from her relatives for her high school education. Later, she worked to earn money and applied for a student loan. In the end, she received a scholarship to study abroad. Most of the money she earned was returned to those relatives. After that, she basically had no contact with my grandmother's family. However, after so many years, until my mother passed away, she still didn't know what happened to her own identity. She only thought that my grandmother didn't like her. Decades ago, there were indeed many wealthy families in China who preferred boys over girls. In China, especially in Jing City, in that era, those who could be called rich were not ordinary, and abandoned baby girls were common. I can't tell what I'm feeling right now. On the one hand, I'm glad that my mother is not related to this family by blood because I really hate their faces. On the other hand, I'm sorry that she didn't know her own identity until she died. Perhaps after so long, we can't find the root cause. But my mother, such a beautiful, strong, and hard-working woman, died of emotional entanglements and physical reasons. At this time, I finally understand why Ji Hongwen was so kind to my mother. Even though she was pregnant with someone else's child, he was willing to marry her and protect her. But I can't imagine, if I really have any relationship with the Shao family, under what circumstances did Chairman Shao, who was married and had children, make my mother pregnant with me, but in the end, he didn't take responsibility and let her marry into the Ji family with the child. I remember that at Chairman Zhao's birthday party, on that cruise ship, when Xiao Lui was going to take me to see his father, you said that I wouldn't be happy to see them. Jin Wan turned to look at Mo Jingshan, who had been listening to her without saying a word. Have you investigated my identity? Do you know that even if I'm really Chairman Zhao's daughter, I may not be willing to acknowledge him? Mo Jingshan gently held her hand in his, saying mildly, from the high fever and coma in the morning to the hospital, to the shopping in the afternoon, until now, your endurance has been greatly reduced. I only heard a lot of things, so I'm not specific. It's just the emotional entanglements between the previous generation. It's not that complicated. You're tired. Take a rest first. We'll talk about it later, okay? Jin Wan turned to look at him and thought for a while. He was right. Since Ji Hongwen asked her to go back to Ji City first, he had planned to tell her everything bit by bit. There was no need for her to ask Mo Jingshan. After all, the real parties involved were Ji Hongwen and Chairman Shao. She lowered her eyes and calmed down. But to be honest, when she thought that her mother had nothing to do with that family, who were too vulgar and greedy, she felt a gust of foul air in her chest was released, and she felt much better. Fortunately, it was not their blood that flowed on her body. Perhaps because she had told him all the things she had kept in her heart, she felt much better now. Jin Wan was about to withdraw her hand from the man's, but Mo Jingshan held her tightly and looked down at the little woman leaning against the seat. You've been alone for 3 years. Are you used to dealing with problems on your own? I'm here. You can lean on my shoulder at any time. You don't have to be alone. Jin Wan pursed her lips and said expressionlessly, Who I am now, aren't you the one who shaped me? The man chuckled because she was still holding a grudge and pulled her to his side. Jin Wan ignored him, closed her eyes, leaned against the seat, and was about to sleep. She refused to lean against him until the man raised his arm and took her in, pressing her head against his shoulder. Jin Wan still wanted to struggle, but Mo Jingshan pressed her head down. Just lean against me. Don't move. Jin Wan wanted to get up, but she was really sleepy. After thinking for a while, she didn't move anymore. She simply leaned against the man, closed her eyes, and said, I'll only lean against you for half an hour. Wake me up in half an hour. The man's low voice was accompanied by a smile. Okay. However, half an hour later, Jin Wan was still sleeping on his shoulder. Of course, Mo Jingshan wouldn't wake her up. When the car passed a speed bump, he raised his hand to support Jin Wan's head and held her in his arms, letting her lie in his arms. Chapter 634. When she returned to High City a few days ago, the people in the company didn't explain the situation. It was not until she came back that she learned that during her absence, High City's Shin Group had been targeting MN Group. First, Ji Mengran's studio made a big move. She launched a land purchase plan with a 50% to 100% ratio. She put up several very good sites for sale and promoted them vigorously. Xing Yihan directly invested a large sum of money in her and there were advertisements everywhere. This move attracted the attention of most real estate developers, causing several plots of land under MN Group to be left unattended. However, in this case, Jean Wan only needed to make a small concession in the price to attract the attention of her peers. After all, this year's real estate prices in High City were indeed the highest in the past 3 years. This opportunity must not be wasted. However, the Xing Corporation had taken a risky move, and there were all kinds of people in the same industry who were causing trouble for her. As a result, Ji Mengran's studio's performance soared this month. Now, as long as it was related to Ji Mengran's studio, whether it was a brand or a partner, anyone with a discerning eye could see that if it continued to develop like this, there would be a second real estate studio in High City and it would gradually establish its own company. Although this studio did not have the assistance of someone like Mr. Zand, it was still rooted in High City and had risen in High City. In addition, it had the backing of the Xing Corporation. If it could obtain a large sum of financing, its performance and competitiveness in High City alone would be close to the current level of the MN Group. Although MN Group now enjoyed a certain reputation and value in the international Chinese community, it was, after all, moved back to China from London, and its roots in High City were not stable. If Ji Mengran deliberately wanted to compete with her through real estate, which was currently a high-income industry, there was really no telling what would happen in the future. Therefore, at this time, Jean Wan stayed in the company and observed the movements of the real estate industry in High City every day. It had been a week since she left the company, nor did she return to the Ji family to deal with those personal affairs. And just a week after Jean Wan returned to High City, the High City media suddenly exposed a piece of news online and in the major print media. The content of the news was all kinds of gossip about MN Group's CEO, Jean Wan, and the news title was even more eye-catching, Shock. Jean Wan, ranked first on the Forbes list of Chinese female entrepreneurs, is actually the ex-wife of the owner of Shine Group. This news not only exposed the fact that Jean Wan was once the #1 socialite of Hai Cheng's upper class, but it also exposed almost all of Jean Wan's life. To the outside world, she was the daughter of the Ji family, the eldest daughter of the Ji family, but to the inside world, her biological father was unknown, and she was not related to the Ji family at all. It was just that the Ji family had never disclosed Jean Wan's identity to the public due to their pride. There was also the marriage between the Ji and Mo families several years ago. Back then, Jean Wan had married into the Mo family and became Mo Jingshan's wife. However, 3 years ago, she divorced and went abroad for unknown reasons. Although the eye-catching content was about Jean Wan and Mo Jingshan's marriage, the actual content only mentioned this matter briefly, and more about Jean Wan's personal situation. For example, why Mo Jingshan divorced Jean Wan before he went to the United States to take over Shine. For example, when Jean Wan went to England, she left with Mr. Zand, who was famous in the foreign business circle. For example, when Jean Wan established the company in London, she hugged, smiled, held hands, and even kissed everyone she met in various social venues and social circles. In fact, these were very polite behaviors in Western communication, but from the angle of the photos, it seemed that she took the initiative to stick to those people, take the initiative to hug or flirt with them. The exposé was full of sarcasm about Jean Wan's road to success, saying that she had climbed into the beds of countless men in the past few years and had flirted with countless men in social events and at the wine table. That was how she had managed to get all the investments she had, and in every tender and new project negotiation, she had used all kinds of shady methods to seize the initiative with her partners. More importantly, among the more than 20 photos, only 4 or 5 had Jean Wan's face. Most of them were accidentally taken by the media at some social events and banquets, and the angles of the photos were indeed misleading. However, the rest of the photos were mostly of her back and profile, but those back and profile looked very similar to Jean Wan. Combined with those photos with her face, it was more certain that the person in those photos must be Jean Wan. However, in those photos with only her profile and back, the woman in the photos was dressed in revealing clothes, being hugged and kissed by men in those ambiguous places, or sitting on a man's lap, the straps of her long dress slipping down, looking as if she was about to be undressed in public without the slightest sense of shame. Her face couldn't be seen clearly in those photos, but they looked very similar to Jean Wan's profile. Jean Wan, once the #1 socialite in High City, was successfully labeled as the #1 social butterfly, and all her achievements in the past few years were forcibly exaggerated by sex deals. For a time, all the companies that had cooperated with MN Group were in an uproar. Phone calls came one after another, and many wives of male partners suspected that their husbands had an affair with Jean Wan, the social butterfly, and scolded her on the internet. MN Group was also in a mess. On the one hand, the phone of the public relations department was almost blown up, and on the other hand, the company was besieged by the media and curious onlookers. Even on the day of the company's regular meeting, the media rushed in and waited at the door of the meeting room, but Jean Wan herself didn't appear. The company was besieged, and people from all walks of life condemned Jean Wan, and slogans such as asking MN Group to get out of High City and go back to London were posted all over the major print media and the internet. Jean Wan was at home in Yuehu Bay. She returned home from the company as soon as the messy news broke out, but she didn't tell anyone, and many employees in the company didn't know where she was now. Since the news broke out, Jean Wan shut herself at home, isolated from the world, sitting on the balcony, looking at Yuehu Lake downstairs, and quietly drinking milk. No one knew why Jean Wan had been particularly quiet these days. After all, it was not in line with her character, but maybe those photos and the news were all true. Maybe she was too ashamed to come out and explain, and she couldn't explain at all. Chapter 635. Many people were surprised that Jean Wan used to be Mo Jingshan's wife. They didn't expect that such a man as a Prince Charming would have such a black mark in his marriage. How could he have been married to Jean Wan? But fortunately, they had divorced. Fortunately, Mo Jingshan was still Mo Jingshan and no longer had anything to do with Jean Wan, a socialite who polluted the business circle. Nowadays, the online media was becoming more and more developed, and news and scandals were wantonly publicized. In 2 days, it had spread all over the country. After all, people were tired of all kinds of news in the entertainment circle, but gossip and scandals among the rich were very fresh, not to mention that it was about the Mo family and the G family in High City. Besides, Jean Wan's MN Group had entered the public's attention like a dark horse since the beginning of the year. Many people were optimistic about MN Group, but of course, there was no lack of secretly envious and malicious people. The higher one stood, the more attention he would receive once he fell into the water. There were many scandals about the upper class and the rich in recent years, but this time, Jean Wan suffered a heavy blow. It could be said that overnight, she was abused and looked down upon by the whole internet, and all kinds of articles about how bitchy Jean Wan was spread wildly in the major media. At night, in the CEO's office of the High City division of Shine Group, Xiaolui pushed the door open, threw the newspapers and magazines in his hands on Mo Jingshan's desk, and looked deeply at the man behind the desk who looked indifferent and calm. It's been 2 days since the incident happened. Our Xiao family couldn't reach out to the Ji family, and Ji Hongwen also refused to help Jean Wan. I thought you must have been trying to help her these days, but I didn't expect that you didn't do anything at all. Seeing Xiao Lui's murderous look, Mo Jingshan's face was calm. Take care of yourself first. When it comes to the Ji family, the Xiao family is really not qualified to help. Xiao Lui's face darkened. If you still don't want to show up, the Xiao family won't sit still. My father has been anxiously looking for Jean Wan these days. He can't eat or sleep well, but she turns off her phone and hides all her contact information. If this continues, who knows what will happen. Those photos of Jean Wan's front were obviously taken at a wrong angle, but those side photos were all taken by Ji Mengran. She and Jean Wan share the same mother but have different fathers, but her figure and profile look similar. As long as she deliberately put on makeup, she would look more like Jean Wan. She asked people to take photos in all kinds of brothels and now exposed them. She must have planned this for a long time. Even if we know she has been plotting this for a long time, what can we do with just a few words of explanation except to support Jean Wan? Can the dirty water that splashed on her be washed clean? Mo Jingshan flipped through the documents without raising his head, calmly saying, "Even she isn't anxious." "Why are you anxious? How do you know she's not anxious?" Xiao Lui glanced at him coldly. "As far as I know, she hasn't contacted anyone in the past 2 days, has she?" Mo Jingshan didn't comment. That little woman locked herself in her home in Yuehu Bay, didn't go out at all, and didn't see anyone. She just sat on the balcony all day in a daze. After the accident, she didn't ask anyone for help. She even knew that he could help her when she was being scolded. He could help her block a lot of unnecessary scolding and even help her solve the problem. But she would rather turn off her phone and sit at home without seeing anyone than give him a call. If he hadn't arranged a live-in nanny upstairs so that he could see what was going on her balcony at any time, even he wouldn't know what was going on with Jean Wan. However, the fact was that when everyone thought Jean Wan was too ashamed to see anyone, and some even suspected that Jean Wan would secretly find a place to commit suicide out of shame, Jean Wan was sitting on the balcony drinking milk and watching the scenery. Obviously, if she could find a way to solve the problem in time, she wouldn't have dragged it on for so long. Dragging it until now could only mean that she couldn't explain herself because of those photos, and she couldn't come up with a good solution even after locking herself up for 2 days. But even at this point, she was still very tough and didn't say a word. Mo Jingshan didn't even need her to beg him at all. Even if she just sent him a WeChat message to let him know that she needed him, all the problems could be solved, but she still kept quiet. Xiao Lui had always been calm, but after 2 days, he didn't hear a word from Mo Jingshan, so he came here to see if he was going to chase Jean Wan back. But now he saw Mo Jingshan was calm and indifferent, and from his understanding of men, he could tell what he was waiting for. Ji Mengran seems to have made a big move this time. It seems that she has made a big move. She confronted Jean Wan head-on in the business circle and suppressed Jean Wan with public opinion. She must hate Jean Wan's company, so she's trying to give her a fatal blow. Xiao Lui glanced at the news that popped up on his cell phone from time to time. In the past 2 days, all the major gossip news had been dominated by Jean Wan's name. He casually threw his cell phone onto the coffee table in the office, took out a cigarette, lit it, and put it in his mouth, narrowed his eyes, and said, "If you don't do something, it's really hard to chase my sister." One of them smoked and the other read documents. Although they were in the same office, they tacitly kept silent. Occasionally, various news about Jean Wan's gossip history popped up on their cell phones at the same time, and the media kept scolding Jean Wan. Even the hot searches about MN Group and Jean Wan on Weibo, which had gradually come into the public's attention in the past 2 years, crushed countless stars in the entertainment circle for 2 days in a row. Xiao Lui didn't sit long and left. Late at night, Mo Jingshan moved his eyes away from the documents in his hand and looked at the computer screen that had been on all the time. The hot news list of the major media was closely following Jean Wan's ranking. It was the news that Ji Mengran's studio had just signed a 300 million yuan land purchase agreement, and more detailed information about Ji Mengran was exposed in the media. It was said that Ji Mengran was the real Missy of the Ji Corporation, that Ji Mengran was qualified to inherit the Ji Corporation, and that Ji Mengran was very business-minded and was comparable to Jean Wan. Mo Jingshan watched as the topic of comparing Jean Wan and Ji Mengran's popularity continued to rise. His brows moved slightly as he smiled coldly. "So that's what you're planning." Chapter 636. Mo Jingshan picked up the phone, dialed a number, and made a simple arrangement. "Find the media person who is pushing the topic of Ji Mengran. There's no need to suppress her. Just let her do it." Then, the man sat quietly at his desk, watching the news on the computer slowly changing. The next day, Shen Mu knocked on the door and entered. "CEO Mo, I found the media company and the photographer who worked with Ji Mengran. These are all the original photos in their camera." Mo Jingshan glanced at him, and Shen Mu quickly came up and handed him the USB flash drive, saying, "The original photos are in here. The person has been taken away by the police for investigation." "I've seen those photos. There are more than 100 of them, from all angles. They haven't been deleted or processed. The ones that have been exposed in the media are the ones that look the most like Miss G from the back and side of the photos. Take a look. The USB flash drive is very interesting. There are even videos. Aside from some unsteady front photos, Ji Mengran's face can also be seen in those videos. Shenmu knew the reason why Mo Jingshan didn't show up for the past 2 days. It was because Jin Wan's current situation was not good enough to protect her. Even if he did, he wouldn't be able to wash away the dirty water on her. What he needed to do was to protect Jin Wan. While protecting her, he had to boil all the dirty water that had been splashed on her before pouring it back on her. Moreover, before there was evidence, it was not a good time for Mo Jingshan to show up for the past 2 days. Seeing that CEO Mo was already looking at the photos, Shenmu didn't speak anymore. He turned to leave the office and picked up his phone to check the news, only to find that all kinds of news about Ji Mengran had suddenly become the hottest topic. Shenmu took a look and smiled. Sure enough, as long as CEO Mo was in control of this matter, it wouldn't be easy for anyone to climb up by stepping on Jin Wan. Jin Wan didn't watch the news tonight. Anyway, it was all about the same things. The incident had been brewing for 2 days. Her initial anger had now become numb. She took out the last dish that she had just cooked and placed it on the dining table. Xia Tian, who was constantly looking at her mobile phone at the table, glanced at the 3 dishes and 1 soup on the table and couldn't help but say, "At this time, you still have the patience to cook. I said that I came to accompany you and see how you are. It's fine if you don't eat at night, but you insisted on cooking and made such a sumptuous meal. If I didn't know better, I would think that you have something to celebrate." Although she said that, Xia Tian's hand still picked up the chopsticks and put a piece of meat into her mouth. She smacked her lips a few times and couldn't help but say, "After you came back, I was pregnant until I gave birth. I didn't have time to accompany you alone. I didn't realize that your cooking skills are so good now. The more you do, the better it will be. Do you cook a lot now? The company is so busy, how can I have time to cook for myself? A few years ago, I could only order takeout from the company. When I was in England, during the most difficult year, I almost cooked every day." She used to cook very well, but now the taste of her cooking was definitely better than that of 3 years ago. After taking a bite, Xia Tian couldn't help but pick other dishes. Then she got up, ran to the kitchen to get a bowl, and came out to drink the soup. In the end, most of the dishes on the table were eaten by Xia Tian. Jin Wan didn't eat much, but she was full. Xia Tian was so full that she had to get up and walk back and forth in her room. When she walked to the balcony and looked down at the moon lake below, she sighed. Fortunately, you moved your home to Yuehu Bay early, and there are not many people who know where you live. The security here is better, and those reporters can't break in. I've been worried about you, but it seems that you are in a good mood, and from what Jin Wan said just now, she could tell that cooking was also a way to vent her emotions. But her calmness was still unsettling. After all, the scolding outside was really unbearable. Xia Tian had wanted to contact the media directly and explain for Jin Wan, but she was afraid that she would cause trouble if she acted rashly, so she came to see her first. Otherwise, will I commit suicide because of depression? Jin Wan put away the dishes and replied as she walked out of the kitchen. Not really. It's just some gossip. If you commit suicide because of this scandal, all the female stars in the entertainment circle who are slandered every day will be dead. Xia Tian leaned against the floor-to-ceiling window on her balcony and looked at Jin Wan, who came to clean up the house. You live here by yourself now. Didn't you hire an aunt to help you? I hired an aunt to come and clean the house every 2 days, but I didn't let her come these 2 days. I want to be alone. Xia Tian looked at her. What's there to be alone? Ji Mengran has clearly prepared for this. Just now, I saw the news and found that the topic about her studio suddenly overshadowed your popularity, and the news about which one of you is qualified to inherit the G Corporation has also spread. She has been thinking about these things for a long time. Jinwan went to pour a glass of water, then held the glass and drank the warm water in it, saying, "Her hatred for me is much more than what you see and know." But this time, she did plan it for a long time. The photos I was taken at the social events in London were all illustrations in some business news of the official media. That's all she could collect. She found some photos that looked ambiguous, enlarged them, and then released all kinds of photos that she deliberately took to confuse the public. Then can't you say that you and Ji Mengran's back and profile are similar? Jinwan chuckled. What's the use of saying it? In this kind of entertainment society, many people will only believe what they want to believe. Even if I explain now and say that the person in those photos is not me, not many people will believe me. Even if I say a bunch of reasons, it will be the same. They will only believe what they see. What's more, the scandals in the rich and powerful can satisfy the mood of many people. If I could wash my name clean with just a few words, would I still need to lock myself up at home for 2 whole days? Xia Tian was silent for a moment and then said, "But now you have a chance to defend yourself." The 2 hot topics about Ji Mengran have become the first and second, and the topic about you has become the third, which proves that her purpose is not pure. Chapter 637. Xia Tian looked at her and asked, "Since Ji Mengran was ready to give you a blow, she must have done it slowly. She suddenly became the first one. Did she make a mistake in her plan because she was too anxious, or did someone push her up? Who else could it be?" In this vast Haicheng, only Mo Jingshan had the ability to control the media and suddenly push Ji Mengran's popularity up in such a short period of time. In fact, Xia Tian had guessed it, but she deliberately asked Jinwan. "Nuan, I think Mo Jingshan actually wants to help you, but you keep turning off your phone and don't contact anyone." Xia Tian looked at her. "This matter is also related to your marriage. Most of the curses are from those women who are jealous of you. It's a fact that you were married to him. Now if he comes to help you, you'll get twice the result with half the effort. You've been very stubborn since you came back from England. I know you were really hurt when you left 3 years ago, but if you can still be with Mo Jingshan, you should control your temper. I think he still favors you, and you don't like any other man except him, do you?" Jinwan didn't speak, just holding the cup and looking down at the 2 most popular topics on her phone. Xia Tian came over again, took her cell phone away, and didn't let her look at it again. When Jinwan had nowhere to look and looked back at her, Xia Tian raised her eyebrows and looked at her. "I'll cover you in a while. Dress up. Your car is too eye-catching now, and you can't take a taxi. Drive my car and go to Mo Jingshan. When did I say I was going to find him? In this situation, what can he do even if he comes to help?" Jinwan's expression was very indifferent. After returning from Ji City, Jinwan had been busy in the company. She hadn't contacted Mo Jingshan these days, probably because she was busy to keep a distance from him. But after returning from Jing City, Jinwan's mood had changed. After returning from Ji City, she couldn't tell what was on her mind now. Mo Jingshan didn't know what to say. "No matter what the result will be, I believe in Mo Jingshan." Xia Tian persuaded her patiently, "You still don't ask him for help at this time. Do you really plan to go out in this way in the future? What's more, it's not just your own reputation that's at stake right now, but also MN Group. You have thousands of employees in your company, and the company's stock has fallen a lot in the past 2 days. If this continues, have you thought about the consequences?" "Yes, but that doesn't mean there's no other way." Xia Tian rolled her eyes at her in exasperation. "You clearly know that no matter what the best method is, with Mo Jingshan's help, it will yield twice the result with half the effort, but you just have to avoid this most important person." Jinwan did not speak. "It's your business that you have a personality, but you're not alone now. You're the president of MN Group and the person in charge. You have the responsibility and the need to deal with this matter as soon as possible, instead of dragging it on like this. There's the shortest way, but you insist on taking a detour. Xia Tian said as she grabbed Jin Wan's arm and dragged her all the way back to the bedroom. What for? I'm going to disguise you. At least dress up so that no one will recognize you when you go out. With that, Xia Tian opened Jin Wan's wardrobe, took out a black hooded sweater, and threw it to her. Then she found a pair of jeans and threw them to her. Finally, she rummaged around and took out a pair of oversized sunglasses for her. Jin Wan, it's so dark now, and you want me to wear sunglasses? Are you afraid that no one can see that I'm sneaking out? Xia Tian. She suddenly took the sunglasses from Jin Wan's hand and turned to take out a stack of medical masks from her bag. I caught a cold half a month ago. I was afraid that I would infect the child, so I went to the pharmacy to buy these masks. They are all new and unused. Put them on later and pretend that you have a cold, so that no one will suspect you. Jin Wan. In the end, Xia Tian saw that Jin Wan was fully dressed and had put on the hood behind the sweater. The hood was big enough to cover the space on both sides of her face. If she walked with her head down in the mask, even if the media had X-ray vision, they might not be able to recognize her. Xia Tian was satisfied and handed her car keys to Jin Wan. Jin Wan looked at the car keys in her hand and then at her fully dressed appearance, and for some reason, she had a feeling that she was being forced to do something. It was already past 11:00 in the evening. Jin Wan was not sure where Mo Jingshan was, and Xia Tian wouldn't let her stay at home in Yuehu Bay. Having nowhere to go, she could only drive around High City. But as she drove, she finally drove to the square opposite the Shine Group. She turned her eyes to the office area on the top floor and saw that the lights of the CEO's office were on. Jin Wan stopped the car. Just as she got out of the car, she happened to see Shenmu coming out of the company. It was so late, but Shenmu was still here. As soon as Shenmu came out, he saw Jin Wan. Although Jin Wan had covered herself up, there was no one in the square opposite the company in the middle of the night. There were only cars passing by quickly on the road, but Jin Wan was standing by the car. If Shenmu hadn't had a strong heart, he would have been startled by her. After staring at Jin Wan for a long time, Shenmu walked over. Seeing Jin Wan fully dressed and her eyes exposed through the mask, he held back his laughter and asked, "Miss Ji?" Jin Wan felt a little embarrassed just now, but being recognized, she had to turn around and look at him. "Why are you still in the company so late?" "I was just about to go home, but CEO Mo should stay in the company tonight. He is still in the office. Are you going to go up to see him?" Shenmu asked. Jin Wan was silent for a moment and said, "I'm just passing by." Shenmu nodded solemnly. "Yes, passing by. Then, Miss Ji, who passed by our company at 11:00 in the middle of the night, if you are sure you don't want to go in to see CEO Mo, I'm leaving. There are security guards in the company at night. If you go in like this, you will probably be stopped outside, and the security guards are likely to send you directly to the police station. Jin Wan, are you sure you don't want to go in to see CEO Mo?" Shenmu asked with a smile. Jin Wan, "Then I'm leaving," Shenmu said, made a gesture of goodbye to her, and turned to leave. Shenmu stopped and looked back at her. Seeing her embarrassed look, he couldn't help but smile. "All right, since you are here, why are you hesitating? I'll take you in." Chapter 638. After sending Jin Wan to the top floor of the company, Shenmu left. After all, it was already late, and Jin Wan didn't want to bother him anymore. But standing outside the elevator on the top floor of Shine Group, in the bright and clean corridor, Jin Wan stood for a long time, glancing in the direction of the light in the CEO's office. The next morning, Shenmu arrived at the company before the others arrived. It was just 7:00 in the morning. When he arrived at the top floor, he didn't see Jin Wan and was about to go to his assistant's office. However, when he passed by the CEO's office, he saw the door was open, and the cleaning staff of the logistics department who got up earlier were cleaning the office. Mo Jingshan had just come out of the break room. It seemed that he was really busy in the company last night and didn't rest much. After taking a shower, he went out of the break room. But there seemed to be no trace of Jin Wan. Shenmu felt that something was wrong. If Jin Wan came, CEO Mo shouldn't be like this, he thought for a while, knocked on the door, and walked in. CEO Mo Jingshan took a look at him and walked to the desk. He picked up the documents on the desk and was about to ask him to hand them over to the planning department when the other employees came to work. However, when he looked at him again, he saw Shenmu's hesitant look and asked indifferently, "What's the matter? Did Miss Ji leave last night?" Mo Jingshan paused and looked at him again. "What? Miss Ji came to the company to see you yesterday. I specially sent her to the top floor and then left." "Didn't she enter the office?" Mo Jingshan put the documents in his hands on the desk and looked at Shenmu, who was standing in front of the door with a puzzled look. "When?" "Last night, around 11 o'clock in the middle of the night. When I was about to go home, I saw her standing in the square opposite the company, standing in the car and hesitating, so I directly sent her in." Mo Jingshan glanced out of the office again, did not speak, and walked out. Shenmu quickly backed away from the door. He saw Mo Jingshan walk out of the office, look around on both sides of the corridor, and then walk toward the escalator closest to the office. The moment he pushed open the escalator door, Mo Jingshan's gaze was fixed on the small black figure. Jin Wan did come to the top floor last night, but considering that Mo Jingshan was still in the company and the lights in the office were on, she guessed that he was busy with something, so she didn't go in. She hesitated for a long time and finally didn't knock on his door. After all, this matter was really tricky for her. She had always thought that when dealing with people like Ji Mengran, she would be fine as long as she didn't let her take advantage of her, but she didn't expect that her sister, who had the same mother but different father, would finally take advantage of her back and profile to give her such a blow. Ji Mengran even seemed to have studied Jin Wan's dressing style in the past 3 years. In those photos, Ji Mengran was wearing the same clothes as Jin Wan, or the style was the same, including her hairstyle. In this case, it was Ji Mengran's full blow and Jin Wan's unpreparedness. Perhaps she should have thought that as early as Ji Mengran said a few words about the inheritance of the Ji Corporation, she should have been prepared, and she wouldn't have been taken advantage of like this. Jin Wan didn't know how to talk to Mo Jingshan. After thinking for a long time, she finally went to the corridor closest to his office and sat on the stairs for several hours. Even now, when it was dawn, she still sat there without moving. The corridor was actually very dark, and there were automatic sensor lights on it. She sat here all night and didn't move, so the lights were naturally off. But before Jin Wan heard anything, she suddenly saw the light come on. She, who was sitting on the stairs with her arms around her knees, paused slightly and subconsciously turned her eyes, only to see the man in a white shirt and black trousers standing at the top of the stairs. He had one hand in his trouser pocket and his eyes were clear and deep as he looked down at her. She froze. The man stood there, looking at her sitting on the stairs with her arms around her knees, and his indifferent tone was emotionless. "Have you been sitting here all night? How is the air in the corridor?" Jin Wan, she abruptly stood up, but because she had been sitting there for too long, her legs were numb. It was as if a sharp electric current was running through her legs and feet. Instantly, she was in so much pain that she leaned against the wall beside her to barely stand. Mo Jingshan was about to approach her when her body swayed. When he saw her leaning against the wall, he slowed down. He lowered his eyes to look at the black hoodie she was wearing and the large hat on her back. He could guess what she had dressed up to come here last night. There was a smile hidden in the man's eyes. It was not very obvious, at least from Jin Wan's point of view. Mo Jingshan's expression was almost as indifferent as a bird's. "How did you know I was here?" Jin Wan waited until the pain in her legs and feet had subsided before she looked up at the man. Mo Jingshan glanced at her. "I don't have X-ray vision. Of course I couldn't know you had been sitting outside my office all night. Shenmu just came to work and found you were not here, so he asked me. Jean Wan pursed her lips. I didn't disturb you, did I? She clearly wanted to come over to ask for his help, but refused to get to the point. She seemed to be afraid that she would disturb him. Mo Jingshan looked at her silently for a moment and said indifferently, You didn't enter the office. How could you disturb me? Who was Mo Jingshan? She was afraid that from the moment he knew she was here, he had already known her purpose of coming here. Jean Wan stood against the wall for a while, thinking that since she had seen him, it seemed that there was no need to continue hiding. She slowly clenched her fists against the wall behind her, thought for a while, and finally spoke. In fact, I've been considering whether to ask you to help me these days, but I don't want to implicate you. The insults on the internet have also affected you. I don't know if they have caused you any trouble. Jean Wan stood there and said softly, Mo Jingshan, it's very difficult for me to get through this, isn't it? The comments on the internet are just moving their fingers. You're such a big-hearted person. Why would you care about what others say? But now I don't have any evidence to prove my innocence. Even if I want to explain, no one will believe me. But if things continue to develop like this, I'm afraid I can't even stay in High City. Who said you need to explain? Mo Jingshan chuckled. Every incident has its own cause. There's no need to panic. Find the cause, and the problem will be easily solved. Jean Wan was startled. What do you mean? The man reached out to her, his voice gentle and patient. Come here. Chapter 639. Seeing the man reach out to her, Jean Wan was silent for a moment, walked up the stairs, and hesitated before raising her hand to grab the man's cuff. She said, Mo Jingshan, I'm here to ask you for help, not to flirt with you. The man gave a faint smile, held her hand in his palm, and pulled her into his arms. Jean Wan stumbled and couldn't stand steadily because she had been sitting like this all night, so she fell into his arms. When her face bumped against his chest, she heard the man's voice, which seemed to be smiling, whispering in her ear, Is there a difference? If it weren't for love, she wouldn't have come to him for help. Jean Wan didn't speak. After all, she was here to ask for help and had no reason to be arrogant. However, the man just looked indifferent as if he didn't care about her affairs, but now she strangely felt as if he had been waiting for a long time. The man took her out of the stairwell and didn't let go of her hand. He looked at the time. You've been sitting in the corridor for so long. Aren't you hungry? Let's go back to the office and have breakfast. Jean Wan still didn't speak and was led into the office by the man. The cleaning staff had left, and Shenmu was sure that Mo Jingshan had found Jean Wan after staying in the corridor for so long, so he went back to the assistant's office. There was no one else here. The bright, spacious, and modern office smelled faintly of fresh fragrance. The cleaning staff must have put some faintly fragrant fungicide on the floor. After Jean Wan entered, he asked her to sit down, and she went to sit on the sofa. The man took a look at her, called someone to send breakfast over, and then called Shenmu to arrange a press conference at 10:00 in the morning. When Jean Wan heard the words, press conference, she thought it was a press conference for a new project of his company. Anyway, if he had something to do, he could go ahead. It made no difference whether she stayed in Yuehu Bay or here. However, after breakfast, the man went to a meeting and asked her to go to his lounge to sleep for a while. Jean Wan was indeed sleepy. After all, she had been sitting in the corridor for so long and hadn't slept all night. It wasn't like she hadn't been to this lounge before. After the man left, she got up and went to the lounge. She didn't know how long he would be busy with the meeting and the press conference. She sat on the edge of the bed and threw her bag and cell phone aside. In the past 3 days, the aggressive news and comments about her on the internet had almost changed her habit of looking at her cell phone before going to bed. She was too lazy to look at it, so she lay down and took a short nap. However, as soon as she closed her eyes, she accidentally fell asleep. An hour and a half later, it was already 9:30 a.m. There was still half an hour before the press conference. Mo Jingshan returned to his office. The person in charge of a department store in High City entered the office with him, holding a set of clothes specially selected for Jin Wan and waiting respectfully in the office. When Mo Jingshan woke Jin Wan up, she was still in a daze. After all, she had only slept for an hour. In a daze, she heard the man say, "Go wash up, change, and come to the press conference with me." She sobered up a little. Looking at the gentle and patient face of the man who bent over the bed to wake her up, it took her a long time to come back to herself. "What press conference? Do you want me to go with you?" Seeing that the little woman was still a little sluggish after being woken up, Mo Jingshan sighed and kissed her on the lips with a smile. With this kiss, Jin Wan woke up completely. She jumped up from the bed and quickly went to wash up. When she went out, she saw the clothes sent by the mall staff. It was a very fitting French brand suit. In short, it looked more suitable for facing the media than the black sweater and jeans Jin Wan was wearing. Jin Wan didn't ask much, but she could guess that Mo Jingshan must have made arrangements for her. She didn't think much and cooperated with him to change. At 10 o'clock, Jin Wan followed him to the so-called press conference, which was a very large multimedia hall on the 5th floor of Shine Group, where other project and product press conferences were held. When she walked in backstage, she saw that the guest seats outside had been filled up so quickly, and judging from the cameras and logos on the microphones in their hands, she was sure that all the major domestic media had arrived. Even the more senior and authoritative major media that never gossiped were present. There were many people here, but after all, this was Shine Group, so no one dared to speak loudly and waited patiently for the press conference to begin. Jin Wan's incident had attracted so many media outlets in such a short time. It could be seen that Jin Wan's incident was breaking news for many media outlets, but the other authoritative domestic media outlets had also arrived in such a short time, which was obviously because of Mo Jingshan's presence. Jin Wan stood backstage and looked at the media. She found that she had been hiding from these people in Yuehu Bay for 2 days, but now standing here and seeing so many people, she didn't panic at all. Why? She turned to look at the man in a black suit beside her. "Although I admit that if you show up, you can help me regain some face, aren't you afraid of being cursed with me by holding a press conference to support me?" The man's indifferent gaze fell on her face. "Are you afraid?" "Of course not." The man chuckled. "Since you came to me, you should put all your trust in me." Of course, Jin Wan trusted him, but this kind of thing was related to their former marriage. She just didn't want to make a big deal out of it, but she didn't expect that Mo Jingshan, who had always been low-key, would choose to hold such a grand press conference. Just as she was about to go on stage, Jin Wan suddenly saw some people behind the media who had snuck in through their connections. For example, Ji Mengran was also in the crowd. She had followed a media friend in. Of course, Shine Group was not a place that could be easily snuck in, unless someone deliberately turned a blind eye to it and let her in. Seeing that Ji Mengran had actually snuck in, Jin Wan narrowed her eyes. Only then did she realize that perhaps Mo Jingshan did not just want to explain and support her. Otherwise, why would he allow Ji Mengran to sneak into the scene? Chapter 640. Jin Wan was wearing a black business-style suit inside and a knee-length cream-white coat outside. Her hair, which was much longer than before, was tucked into a hair tie of the same color, and she was wearing a pair of high-heeled boots. Just like her usual image in the company and in front of the media, she was exquisite, bright, and had an extraordinary temperament. It was as if she had not been defeated by the scandals of the past few days. Instead, the light in the bottom of her eyes was clear. When she walked out from the back and faced the media, she was also calm and fearless. But Mo Jingshan didn't let her speak, so she just walked out and sat down on the stage with a calm smile on her face. CEO Mo, you rarely attend press conferences in person. Many of your company's important new projects press conferences are usually attended by the vice president or other people in charge of the company. It can be said that you rarely appear in public like this in front of the media. Is it because of the reputation of your ex-wife, Miss G, or for other reasons that you suddenly hold a press conference in person this time? CEO, are you going to say something on behalf of Miss G? Both of you appear at the same time. Can it prove that CEO G of MN Group was indeed married to you? The news of the marriage between the G and MO families in High City many years ago has been dug out, but we haven't seen your photo. I wonder if CEO Mo has anything to say. I wonder what President Mo's opinion is on Miss G's frequent flirting with her business partners in recent years, and her conduct is improper. She has even been involved in a sex trade. CEO Mo, is it because Miss G is really desperate that she has to ask you to explain for her? As soon as Mo Jingshan appeared, the reporters had begun to ask questions. However, the man just coldly looked at the media at the press conference and listened to their questions. These reporters had restrained themselves. At least, although their questions were tricky, they were not as tricky as they were in other places. At least, they were still afraid of Shine Group and Mo Jingshan, but they still had to ask some key questions in such a big news. After some related questions were asked, Mo Jingshan took the microphone from the reporters. There are only two parts of today's press conference. The first part is to look at the photos and say something. Why don't you sit quietly and wait? After looking at the photos and videos, we'll start the interview. Hearing this, the reporters quickly returned to their seats. When the audience fell silent, Jinwan suddenly felt there was a light behind her. Only then did she notice that the black screen behind her had a projector function, and it was a very high-definition 300-inch screen. She looked back and saw the black screen lit up. The first photo that appeared was the ambiguous and unsightly photo of Jinwan sitting on a partner's lap and feeding him a drink, mouth to mouth, that had been widely spread in the media. As soon as this photo was released, there were some boos in the hall, but Jinwan was sitting at the bottom of the screen and looking at the photo. Although she didn't know what Mo Jingshan had prepared, she could at least regard herself as a bystander and didn't feel too nervous or ashamed. After all, the person in the photo was not her at all. However, the photos were played in the form of a slide. After the first photo stayed in the audience's eyes for about 5 seconds, it was changed to another photo. This photo was the same scene and the same person as the first one, but the angle was different. Obviously, the other photos were taken continuously due to the movements of the characters. In this photo, Jinwan was no longer a back view, but a side face, which still looked very similar to Jinwan. In the third photo, the angle was changed again, because Jinwan had unintentionally turned her face and seemed to be smiling, but this time, at least 1/3 of her face could be seen. The latter two photos were not in the photos exposed by the media. The reporters present didn't understand the significance of these photos, but then it was time for them to slap their faces. Hundreds of photos, from all angles, back, profile, front, high definition, and some blurry because they were taken in a hurry, were projected one by one. Many of the photos that could be seen from the front surprised the reporters, because from the front, Jinwan was not the same person at all, but her profile and back were very similar. Even Jinwan didn't expect that Mo Jingshan could find out who took these photos and find the source of the original photos. At first, she thought these were Ji Mengran's photos, but at this moment, she realized that Ji Mengran must have hired some familiar reporters and paid them to secretly take photos from a distance. Only in this way could Jinwan be found out by accident. It turned out that this was the source of what Mo Jingshan said. Jinwan didn't speak but continued to look at Ji Mengran's face on the big screen that gradually became clear. At the same time, she turned her eyes to look at Ji Mengran, who was hiding behind the crowd and whose face was getting paler and paler under her sunglasses. Almost more than 100 photos, all of which were not released in front of the media and were exposed by the media, were included. Those who knew about photography could naturally see what was going on in these photos. These were the original photos without any image processing. These photos were broadcast live on TV, which was enough to prove that Jinwan was really wronged. The woman whose back and profile were very similar to Jinwan was not her at all. If one didn't look at them with a dirty and ambiguous gaze, those photos with Jean Wan's face were just normal social behaviors in British social circles, and there was nothing out of line. And they didn't expect that after the photos, there would be several videos. In the videos, the woman deliberately stuck close to the bodies and legs of the partners, in various places, and from time to time rubbed her buttocks against the partners' lower bodies. At the same time, the woman in the video turned her head to ask the cameraman, "Are you done? It must be the effect I want, or it'll be a waste of effort." For a moment, the audience was in an uproar. Although not many people knew Ji Mengran's name, she was the second daughter of the Ji family, and there would always be some reporters who knew her and those who had interviewed her studio. Chapter 641. No wonder Ji Mengran's studio signed a new project and inherited the Ji Corporation were the hot topics yesterday afternoon and evening. It turns out that she deliberately framed Jean Wan. It turns out that her sister came out to frame her. What a treacherous person. The video on the giant screen continued to play. Ji Mengran's smiling face suddenly froze on the screen. At the same time, the reporters on the stage kept taking pictures of the man and woman sitting calmly on the stage. The traffic of the various news media, which was already about to explode, suddenly surged in. In this half an hour, the popularity of the video suddenly skyrocketed and didn't go down. These are all photos. Even the date, time, and file size of the photos are displayed next to the photos. You can tell at a glance that they are the originals. The photos that were exposed a few days ago have obviously been manipulated. Otherwise, even if Ji Mengran deliberately imitated Jean Wan's clothes and makeup, it can't be so similar. Those photos are fake, and these are the real ones. The faces of the reporters were all filled with anger. They had originally come to join in the fun of this ugly show of a wealthy family and wanted to find some explosive news to take credit for. However, the media had human nature after all. Faced with such a truth, all of them looked extremely resentful. However, when the audience had known the truth and the audience was full of curses against Ji Mengran, Mo Jingshan remained calm and sat there without a ripple. After seeing those photos, Jean Wan also calmly smiled. Was this enough to prove that before she came to him, Mo Jingshan had long been looking for the person who took the photos? Ji Mengran had hidden so well that it was not easy to find her, but he found these photos in 2 days and quickly held a press conference for her. With Mo Jingshan's influence and Jean Wan's current popularity, now these photos were the truth. They didn't need to say a word. People who were not stupid would know the whole story. Also, yesterday, the various topics about Ji Mengran became the first and second place, attracting a lot of people's attention. Now, with these photos and Ji Mengran's topic, many things were self-evident. Mo Jingshan and Jean Wan remained calm in front of the media, but behind the crowd, when Ji Mengran heard their curses, her expression changed from rigid to one of fear. She slowly stepped back, trying to leave this place. However, just as Ji Mengran was about to run out, 2 security guards who had been waiting outside the door for a long time blocked her way. They looked at her coldly, not giving her a chance to leave. "You!" Ji Mengran glared at them angrily. "Move!" The entire press conference had progressed to the point Mo Jingshan expected, and the man coldly said, "I wonder if everyone is satisfied with the first segment of looking at pictures and talking?" The media couldn't help but sigh. "I didn't expect to make such a big mistake. I've really wronged CEO Ji. But after the truth is revealed, what is CEO Mo's so-called second step?" Mo Jingshan coldly curved his lips. His gaze passed through the crowd and landed on Ji Mengran, who was blocked by the door of the multimedia hall by the security guards. For the second segment, the person in question, the second Miss Ji, should naturally be the one to explain to everyone. This self-directed show, where exactly did she learn this idea from, and what is her motive? As soon as Mo Jingshan finished speaking, all the media present looked back at the door. When they saw the woman who was dressed in low-key clothes, they immediately understood what was going on, got up, and rushed over with the cameras. Ji Mengran didn't expect that today. She just came here to see Jean Wan make a fool of herself. After all, Jean Wan couldn't explain the whole thing, even if Mo Jingshan showed up, but she didn't expect that the original photos would be found, nor did she expect that Mo Jingshan had set up this trap and waited for her to jump into it. The media immediately rushed over. She didn't need the security guards to stop them. In an instant, she was surrounded and had no way out. What are you doing? Ji Mengran pressed the oversized sunglasses on her glasses hard and lowered her head to cover her face, refusing to be photographed by the cameras. However, the photos on the screen were all of her face, and it made no difference whether she covered her face or not. Ji Mengran, how could you come here? Do you really think you can completely ruin your sister's reputation? Fortunately, we saw so many original photos from different angles today. Otherwise, I'm afraid all the media and people on the internet would have been fooled by you. I can't believe sisters would use such cruel and shameless means to frame each other. Since you're here, why don't you tell me what you think? Just as the media surrounded Ji Mengran, Mo Jingshan glanced at them indifferently and then his eyes fell on Ji Mengran. Second Miss Ji. His voice was low, as if entwined with an indescribable sarcastic smile. The influence of today's press conference is not small. So many authoritative media are here. It's more direct than finding someone to casually post more than 20 photos on the internet. Since you are here, why don't you finish the second part of the press conference? The man's smile seemed to be quenched with ice, drilling into people's bones and blood, making them feel cold. Ji Mengran covered the sunglasses on her face, her fingertips trembling. She tried to hold back her emotions, turned to look at the stage, gritted her teeth, and suddenly took off her sunglasses. Facing the media and the two people on the stage, she said angrily, "Even if I did it, so what? Jean Wan is not my father's biological daughter. What right does she have to inherit the G Corporation's property? Even I, the biological daughter of the G family, am excluded because of her? My father told me clearly that I won't get a penny from the G family. Why? She is an illegitimate daughter who doesn't even know who her father is. Why?" However, in the face of Ji Mengran's angry accusation, the media kept their cameras on her. Standing 100 meters away, Mo Jingshan looked at the woman who was panic-stricken but forced herself to calm down and said lightly, "Second Miss Ji, if I were you, I would directly admit to the media how my actions over the years have disappointed and dissatisfied your biological father. He would rather hand over the family business to his adopted daughter who is worth tens of billions than hand it over to you, his biological daughter, to be ruined." Ji Mengran's face turned paler and paler, and her pupils kept contracting, but the man smiled coldly. "At least, even if you really ruin Jean Wan's reputation in such a disgraceful way, the one who knows you and your sister best is still Chairman Ji, and the G Corporation's inheritance will still not be handed over to you. After all, your father knows you best. How bad are you to be abandoned by your biological father like this? Dash. Chapter 642. Jean Wan didn't speak. Since Ji Mengran was exposed and the media surrounded her, she seemed to have nothing to do with this show. Seeing the cameras kept pointing at her, Ji Mengran angrily raised her hand to push them away, but the reporter standing closest to her said coldly, "Miss Ji, these cameras are not cheap. If you break them, are you going to compensate us with brand new ones?" As the reporter spoke, they deliberately brought the microphone to Ji Mengran's mouth. "Don't glare at us like this. Since you framed your sister through the media, isn't it natural that you're surrounded by the media now?" The reporters were very good at pestering people. Now that the truth had been revealed, they wanted to take revenge on Ji Mengran. Jean Wan didn't speak, just looked in that direction, and her face was covered with a layer of cold sarcasm. The next second, Ji Mengran forcefully pushed away the microphones in front of her. She grabbed another microphone with an ugly expression and was about to smash the cameras. "It doesn't matter if it's broken. I can't even afford to pay for these cameras." However, rather than smashing the cameras, she wanted to destroy today's evidence. Just as Ji Mengran was about to smash the cameras, Jean Wan stood in front of her and said calmly, "If necessary, I can help you record again." Hearing Jin Wan's words, Ji Mengran froze. The originals of those photos were in Immerse Jingshan's hands. Even if the cameras were smashed today, they could record again at any time. Ji Mengran's eyes were red with anger. She turned to see that Jin Wan was still sitting on the sofa on the stage, holding her chin with one hand and looking in this direction with a very indifferent look. Since Miss Ji is very dissatisfied with today's press conference, why don't you record again? I'll give you one last chance to clarify yourself. Those photos that have been manipulated to confuse people, and your real purpose, why don't you say it yourself? Everyone could feel the bone-chilling coldness behind Immerse Jingshan's indifferent tone. The situation in front of the multimedia hall was getting out of control. Because of Immerse Jingshan's words, those people pressed closer to Ji Mengran, asking her to say her purpose and intention. What purpose could she have? Driven by Immerse Jingshan, many things had become obvious reasons. At this moment, all the people who had watched the live broadcast of the press conference were cursing Ji Mengran on the internet. And Ji Mengran's face was the palest and most panicked expression Jin Wan had ever seen. It seemed that she had been extremely panicked and forced by these people. She wanted to get angry but dared not, and her shoulders were trembling uncontrollably. She clenched her hand hard, and the calmness on her face could hardly be maintained. A person who should not be surnamed Ji is about to take away our Ji's property. I am not reconciled, so I try to do something to fight for my own interests. Now that things have come to this, I have nothing to say. Ji Mengran didn't care about anything else. She lowered her head and was about to rush out of the crowd when she finally managed to push a few people away. Just as she was about to run out of the multimedia hall, she suddenly saw Ji Hongwen standing outside the door, just behind the crowd. The moment Ji Mengran rushed out, she froze in her tracks. She was surprised to see Ji Hongwen here. Ji Mengran couldn't care less. She lowered her head and was about to rush out of the crowd. However, when she was about to run out of the multimedia hall, she suddenly saw Ji Hongwen standing outside the door. The moment Ji Mengran rushed out, she froze and looked at Ji Hongwen, who was here. Mengran, you complained publicly in front of the media that you couldn't get a penny from the Ji Corporation. You're really my good daughter. Ji Hongwen's face darkened and he said coldly and angrily, I don't intend to give the Ji Corporation to you. Don't you know the reason? Jin Wan has her own MN group. Even if I give her everything in the Ji family, it will still belong to the Ji family. She will protect everything that belongs to the Ji family. And you? Once I give the Ji Corporation to you, with your stupid brain, I'm afraid it will be swallowed up by the Xing Corporation overnight. Ji Mengran's eyes were red. She had lost face after exposing the truth in front of the media, but she didn't expect that Immerse Jingshan could so quickly and ruthlessly invite Ji Hongwen here. Was he going to help Jin Wan turn the situation around and kick her into hell? Is this Director Ji? Sure enough, it's Director Ji. Director Ji, since you're here, why don't you tell us what's going on between your two daughters? Some of the media had approached Ji Hongwen, but Ji Hongwen wouldn't speak for her at all. He had always been on Jin Wan's side, the one who was not his biological daughter. Ji Mengran's expression stiffened and her pupils dilated as she stared in Ji Hongwen's direction. Then, the light in her eyes started to crack bit by bit. Even though her facial expression didn't change, it was clear that she was on the verge of breaking down. Because Ji Hongwen was here, Jin Wan got up and walked toward the door. After all, Ji Mengran was surrounded by the media, but Ji Hongwen was the chairman of the Ji Corporation. People at his age rarely dealt with the media, so she'd better get him out of here as soon as possible. Jin Wan walked into the crowd, came to Ji Hongwen's side, and raised her hand. Everyone, I'm sorry. Most of today's press conference is about the analysis and explanation of the photos that are close to slander. As for the irrelevant topics, they are mostly family affairs. Please mind your manners. Seeing Jin Wan raise her hand to shield Ji Hongwen, Ji Mengran coldly glared at Jin Wan with reddened eyes. In order to prevent Jin Wan from being squeezed by the crowd, Ji Mengran instinctively raised his hand to shield Jin Wan. Seeing this affectionate scene between father and daughter, Ji Mengran suddenly sneered. She abruptly grabbed a camera on the shoulder of a person behind her and viciously smashed it in Jin Wan's direction. Ah! Watch out, no one expected that Ji Mengran would suddenly take such an extreme action. The camera was not small and was very heavy, and a few screams broke out from the crowd. Just as Jin Wan turned around and saw the camera smashing toward her, before she could dodge, Mo Jingshan, who had walked over, grabbed her, and quickly pulled her into his arms. At the same time, he turned his back to block the camera for her. Fortunately, Mo Jingshan had pulled her away from the camera. Even though he took the blow for her, the force of the falling camera was much less than before. It only brushed against his shoulder and then fell heavily to the ground. God, it was too dangerous. Are you all right, CEO Mo? Are you all right? Chapter 643. Jin Wan was startled by the sound of the camera hitting Mo Jingshan's shoulder. She raised her eyes with a jerk and looked at the man who suddenly came to protect her in his arms. Although the angle of the camera was crooked and not too heavy, she instinctively raised her hand and put it on the man's shoulder. At the same time, she asked in a low voice that no one could hear, Mo Jingshan, are you crazy? If she didn't miss, your shoulder would have been broken by that camera. However, the man held her in his arms and lowered his eyes to look at the fear in her eyes. He curled his lips and ignored the reporters and onlookers present. He only chuckled and said, if I was really injured, there would be a reason for you, little ingrate, to stay and take care of me. Jin Wan, she didn't continue to speak. In the blink of an eye, Ji Mengran was held down by the security guards to prevent her from doing anything drastic. Second Miss Ji, are you angry out of humiliation? Mo Jingshan held on to Jin Wan's waist and did not let go. He turned to look at Ji Mengran, who was restrained by the security guards and had red eyes. Even though Mo Jingshan appeared to be smiling, anyone could sense the coldness and displeasure in him because she had almost hurt Jin Wan with her attack earlier. Ji Mengran's emotions had long slipped to the brink of collapse. Mo Jingshan. Both of you are divorced. There was no relationship at all. You're actually helping her. You actually. Mo Jingshan coldly smiled and held Jin Wan tighter in his arms. When Jin Wan didn't understand what he was going to do, the man said calmly and slowly, since so many reporters are here, I'd better clarify something for Jin Wan. Hearing Mo Jingshan's words, several reporters who were closest to him put their microphones close to him. The man said flatly, whether it was 3 years ago or 3 years later, Jin Wan is always my wife. The news about our divorce is just a rumor. We have never divorced. Jin Wan instantly stiffened in his arms, and the reporters around them were even more surprised. But the divorce news that has spread like wildfire doesn't look fake. Everyone is so curious about this Mo's family matters. Mo Jingshan's mild and ordinary voice rang above Jin Wan's head. Is my verbal proof not enough to convince people of Mrs. Mo's identity? Do you want me to take out the marriage certificate and make it public? I don't think so. I never thought Miss Ji would actually be Mrs. Mo. Jin Wan, Ji Mengran was in disbelief. That's impossible, that's impossible. The two of you are clearly divorced. When Jin Wan went to London 3 years ago, you were already divorced. Mo Jingshan's response to her was one emotionless sentence, whether to leave or not, as the person involved, isn't it clearer? After finishing his words, Mo Jingshan's movements did not falter. He held Jin Wan's hand and walked past the crowd, leaving the multimedia hall. Right now, the media's focus was on Ji Mengran. Furthermore, the misunderstanding had been cleared. Mo Jingshan, who was usually too lazy to deal with the media, was able to deal with the media today. Naturally, no one dared to chase after him. The corridor of Shine Group was very spacious and clean. It was a completely modern building with special office facilities on each floor. The man opened the elevator door and led her in. It was quiet in the elevator for a long while. Jin Wan turned to look at herself in the mirror and the man who had been quiet and indifferent. She then looked at the changing numbers in the elevator and seemed to be lost in thought. The man's low voice broke the almost stiff silence. What's wrong? Before you go to the Civil Affairs Bureau to find out your marital status, you suddenly find out that you are still Mrs. Mo. Are you feeling very complicated? Jean Wan came back to herself and whispered, Did you just say that in front of the media, or are you really not divorced? He said flatly, I thought you already had a conclusion in your heart. She said with some amusement, Mo Jingshan, it was you who forced me to divorce. I even signed the divorce papers, but you tell me you're not divorced? Mo Jingshan was a man who would never beat around the bush and delay a problem as long as he could solve it directly. However, when it came to the divorce, he tried every possible way to force her to leave. She thought that in the past 3 years, she had nothing to do with him. Previously, she had been hoping that maybe the divorce was under his control. Since he had decided to divorce, he would definitely divorce her. But now she heard him say that he had never divorced her. How on earth did he do it? How could he be so calm when everything was clearly in his heart, in his eyes, and in his control, so that no one could see anything? She wanted to ask and had a lot to say, but she suddenly didn't know where to start. She thought for a while and picked the simplest question. After I signed the divorce papers, I sent them to you. Didn't you sign them? The man said flatly in a low voice, As you said, I was the one who proposed the divorce. Although I didn't want to force you to leave in that way, after all, I had to follow the trajectory of my life. Some things should always stand at the original position in order to continue the continuation of various events. So did you sign them or not? He replied methodically, Before I returned to the United States to take over Shine, I took some time to bring the divorce papers to the Civil Affairs Bureau. Before the final signing, I was told that the divorce could not be divorced unless both parties were present. Although I did have a way to invite the most powerful lawyer in the country to come and find a reasonable reason to divorce the marriage, according to my understanding of you, when we divorced, you didn't have the ability to make the divorce papers take effect. Jean Wan. You mean the divorce papers? Jean Wan didn't react for a moment and was stunned. When you left High City and went directly to the United States, I gave the signed divorce papers to a friend in the Civil Affairs Bureau and asked him to help me with the divorce. But then something happened to this friend's family, and I haven't been able to contact him. I didn't have time to go to the Civil Affairs Bureau and didn't ask carefully. The man's bony fingers casually adjusted the exquisite and expensive buttons on his shirt cuffs, and he turned his head to glance at her indifferently. So, whether in the past or now, our divorce procedures have stopped at the signing of the divorce papers, and we haven't gone to the final procedure of stamping the seal. Jean Wan inexplicably read a bit of a good mood from his indifferent tone, as if this realization that he suddenly realized 3 years ago when he was at the last step had become the biggest reason for him to be particularly shameless in front of her now. Chapter 644. She was brought back to the office by the man. After all, it was the working hours of Shine Group, and a secretary was already waiting in the office. Seeing them come back, the secretary took a look at Jean Wan, made sure she was not an outsider, and went to report some work to Mo Jingshan. Mo Jingshan didn't say anything after entering the door. After listening to the secretary's report, he took the document, read a few pages, and said a few words. It was not until the secretary left that the office was quiet again. Jean Wan had been sitting in his office, but when he was busy with work just now, she just got up and went to the water dispenser to pour a cup of hot water. But from Mo Jingshan's point of view, the woman was holding the cup and drinking water, and her expression was cold. The black pot that has been pressing on your head for 2 or 3 days has been uncovered, and the biggest problem has been solved. Are you going to repay me with such a cold face? Jean Wan glanced at him deadpan. Otherwise, how do you want me to repay you? Do you want me to sacrifice myself here? The man smiled lightly. That's a good idea. Jean Wan rolled her eyes at him. I'm tired and sleepy. I want to go home and sleep. She really hadn't had a good rest these days. Last night, she went to his company in the middle of the night, but she sat in the corridor for so long. In the morning, she only slept for an hour and a half in his break room. Now that the problem had been solved, she felt much more relaxed. She didn't want to think about anything but to have a good sleep and adjust her mind. And she needed time to think about how to face this man. Jin-won did look tired, and Mo Jingshan's voice softened. Then go back to rest, take a good bath, and have a good sleep. Jin-won didn't speak anymore and got up to leave. I'll drive you. No, I drove Xia Tian's car here last night. She's still at my house. I'm going to drive the car back. She needed to rest and adjust her mood. Mo Jingshan looked at her for a while, nodded, and said gently and patiently, "You haven't had a good rest these days. Stay awake when you drive." Jin-won ignored him. Before she went out, the man said with a smile, "Drive safely, Mrs. Mo." Jin-won paused, abruptly turned around and gave him a hard look. "If you call me that again, believe it or not, I'll write you another divorce agreement tomorrow." The man smiled. "I believe you, Mrs. Mo." Jin-won. She turned around angrily and was about to leave. The man probably saw her angry look again. He smiled lightly and said in a good mood, "See you tomorrow." When Jin-won drove back to Yuehu Bay, Xia Tian had already left. She only sent her a WeChat message, saying that the baby at home hadn't seen his mother all night and had been crying. The nanny they hired to hold the baby all night was useless, so she hurriedly drove Jin-won's car home. Jin-won first took a bath and felt much more relaxed. Then she went back to bed, hugged the pillow, and slept hard for a day and a night. The next morning, Jin-won returned to the company in a good state after the truth was revealed and the curses and dirty water poured on her were completely washed away. As for Mo Jingshan's promise to see her tomorrow, she fell asleep and didn't plan to see him at all. She was probably the only one who couldn't control this kind of scheming man. He couldn't control her mood, her freedom, and her thoughts. Occasionally, he miscalculated, so that Jin-won could at least feel better. The next day, Jin-won was preparing to return home when she suddenly received an invitation from the city's newly appointed official charity organization. This charity organization had set up a banquet and invited more than half of Hai Cheng's famous business figures. Although it was called a charity organization, it was actually nothing more than to win over these rich people in the city. After all, the government and the business were never separated. Furthermore, for something like charity, many times, it required the cooperation of businessmen. The charity banquet was set to be held tomorrow night. It was not that they didn't give Jin-won time to prepare, but that people had received invitations 3 days ago. However, Jin-won had been misunderstood by the leaders of the city because of those photos a few days ago. They thought that she was really up to no good and didn't plan to put her on the invitation list at all. In the end, the dirty water was suddenly cleared, and the higher-ups promptly issued her an invitation. Thus, when she received the invitation, there was only 1 day left until the banquet. As a result, Jin-won didn't have time to return home. She took the time to pick out a gown. At night, Jin-won lay on the bed and closed her eyes. However, she had slept too much last night and couldn't sleep well tonight. She picked up her phone and glanced at Mo Jingshan's WeChat profile picture. No matter how she looked at it, she felt unhappy. She searched for some pictures of icebergs online and sent them to Mo Jingshan. A minute after she sent it, the man replied, ? Jin-won, hurry up and change your profile picture. These pictures of icebergs are suitable as your profile picture. It suits your character. Don't always hang my photo on it. Mo Jingshan, ? Another question mark. She didn't know if he was busy or what. Jin-won impatiently sent him another message, hurry up and change it. This time, the man finally replied, but it was short and straightforward, infuriating, not changing. Jin-won held her phone to her mouth and sent him a voice message, Mo Jingshan, if you use my photo as your profile picture again, do you believe that I won't blacklist you? However, the man's reply was, don't mess around. Jin-won, she abruptly threw her phone to the side of the pillow and lay there, turning to look at the night sky outside the window. In fact, after thinking about it carefully, all these years, Mo Jingshan had never done anything to let her down. If they really didn't divorce, then the knot in her heart could be considered resolved. The only thing that made her angry about him was his rationality and calmness that surpassed all emotions. A person who was too calm was actually very scary, wasn't it? She closed her eyes and was silent for a moment. Then she abruptly picked up her phone again, opened Mo Jingshan's WeChat, and very quickly added the man's WeChat to her blacklist. Seeing that he obediently stayed in the blacklist, Jinwan finally let out a breath. She turned her phone to silent with a refreshed expression and planned to sleep. However, not long after she closed her eyes, she vaguely felt a flash of light. She opened her eyes and turned her head to see that her phone screen was on. It had been on for a while. She leaned over to take a look. As expected, it was a call from Mo Jingshan. Chapter 645. It's so late. I just blacklisted you on WeChat. Do you have to call me? Can't you let me sleep well? Jinwan complained. The man said indifferently, it's so late. Do you have to blacklist me just because of a profile picture that hasn't been changed since the beginning? Jinwan, I'm going to sleep. I'll add you back when you change it. With that, Jinwan didn't wait for the man to speak, so as not to be choked by him again. She quickly hung up the phone. In Aolan International, the man's tall figure leaned against the door frame. His dark and deep eyes narrowed slightly, looking at the phone screen that had darkened because the woman had hung up on him. The next morning, Jinwan got up, took a shower, and came out. When she picked up her cell phone, she saw that her number was still on the page that she had blacklisted on WeChat yesterday. She casually clicked on Mo Jingshan's profile picture in the blacklist and refreshed it for a long time. In the end, he didn't change it. That night, at the charity dinner. The dinner was a very ordinary dinner, and most of the guests were famous people in the city. After returning to China, Jinwan had attended a lot of social events and dinner parties, and many people were familiar with her. Although she had washed away the dirty water that had been splashed on her a few days ago, it was inevitable that there would still be people talking about her behind her back. What's more, the fact that Jinwan was Mo Jingshan's wife shocked many people. The men who often took the opportunity to hit on her no longer dared to approach her. After all, Jinwan was already quite famous in the Chinese business world. Now that they knew that the person behind her was Mo Jingshan, no one dared to provoke her. The dinner party didn't end until 10:30 p.m. It was already 10 o'clock. Jinwan drank red wine in boredom and waited patiently for the dinner party to end. Although the men didn't dare to approach her tonight, some famous ladies or rich ladies who admired her occasionally came over to say hello to her, but most of their chats were tentative, and they all had forced smiles on their faces. They were all asking her if what CEO Mo said in the media a few days ago was true. Someone toasted her. Jinwan had drunk no more than 2 glasses of red wine here tonight, and most of the red wine was only at the bottom of the glass. She politely took it, clinked glasses with them, and talked and laughed with them as she usually did at social events, but everyone had a smile on their face and actually had their own thoughts. After drinking, they chatted for a while and then dispersed. Finally, at 10:30 p.m., the dinner party ended as scheduled. After the speeches of the city leaders, the hall was filled with thunderous applause. Jinwan played with a glass of red wine in her hand that she had just taken from a waiter. As the crowd gradually walked out, she put the half-drunk wine on the tray of a passing waiter and turned to leave. Just as Jinwan was about to walk out of the hotel, her eyes suddenly went dark. She was stunned for a few seconds before she came to her senses. She didn't know whether the power was off or the switch was tripped. Fortunately, the dinner party was over, and this place was not far from the exit. Otherwise, she didn't know how chaotic the scene would be. Jinwan lifted the hem of her gown and was about to follow the crowd out in the dark. She was surrounded by people who were rushing forward because of the sudden darkness, so the sound of footsteps approaching Jean Wan was drowned out. With a bang, the handbag in Jean Wan's hand fell to the ground, making a muffled sound. In the rightmost room on the 10th floor of the hotel, Xing Yihan stood under the shower in the bathroom. The warm water fell densely like rain, and the man's tall and slender figure was shrouded in the dense white mist in the bathroom. He closed his eyes, and his breathing strangely became a little messy. He was also present at the charity dinner tonight, but after only an hour, he left because he felt unwell. His secretary learned that he was not feeling well and arranged a room for him in this hotel. From the beginning, he didn't feel anything other than an inexplicable heat. However, at this moment, as the hot water invaded his body, Xing Yihan only felt that his body was gradually heating up. The scene of him seeing Jean Wan at the dinner party kept replaying in his mind. Ever since he was chased out of the Ji family by Ji Hongwen, the one thing he had to do in this life was to swallow up everything in the Ji family, no matter what methods he had to use. Even if the Xing family was powerful enough and didn't need the Ji family's influence, the hatred from his youth had been hidden in his heart for so many years. Some things were a lifetime shadow. Even if he didn't need it, he had to get it. Even if, in the end, he abandoned Jean Wan and chose to keep Ji Mengran by his side as a puppet. Ji Mengran's various means were either clever or stupid, but every step went in the direction he expected. Except for occasionally assisting her, he didn't need to worry about anything else. After all, Ji Mengran, that idiot, could definitely turn the Ji family upside down. However, in the end, Ji Mengran's wish didn't come true. Xing Yihan didn't show up for what happened some time ago, but he knew everything that happened. Why didn't he show up? Perhaps it was because the person Ji Mengran was targeting was Jean Wan, the only person in the Ji family whom he had been thinking about for a long time but could only watch from afar. Even though so many years had passed and the shadow of his youth was still there, the obsession of his youth was still buried deep in his heart. He thought of Jean Wan tonight. She was wearing a light-colored, off-shoulder gown, which was very simple, clean, and elegant. She had light makeup on her face. The pretty face that had haunted his world for many years seemed to have not changed after so many years. Except for the wrinkles between her brows that had increased with the passage of time, she was still the same her. For a moment, he even hoped to see Jean Wan hiding in the crowd, quietly holding a glass of wine and finally falling drunk in a corner so that he could have a chance to carry her out. Then, when she slapped his face with the back of her hand in a daze and asked him who he was, he didn't have to tell her that he would be her brother living under the same roof in the future, but that he would tell her that he was Xing Yihan. Probably because of that thought, he felt a burning sensation in his lower abdomen, and the inexplicable turmoil in his body made him feel uncomfortable, so he withdrew his gaze and left. However, he didn't expect that when he took a shower in his room, he would roughly realize what was going on in his body. Chapter 646. When did it happen? He only drank 2 glasses of red wine at the dinner party. Was there something wrong with the 2 glasses of red wine? Xing Yihan opened his eyes, only to feel dizzy. When he closed his eyes again, he saw a fragrant and charming picture in front of him, and the woman in the picture was Jean Wan. The man raised his face slightly, his Adam's apple kept rolling, and his lips gradually emitted an uncontrollable heavy breath. Jean Wan's face kept flashing in front of his eyes, and he even imagined Jean Wan's naked appearance. His body temperature was getting higher and higher, and the picture in his mind was more intense. The heat in his lower body gradually accumulated to the point of explosion, and he had to switch the hot water in the bathroom to cold water. Almost at the same time, there was a sudden sound of the door being opened outside. Xing Yihan stood in the bathroom, one hand on the wall, and the cold water gradually made him calm and rational. His eyes were so quiet that they were almost dark, and he listened carefully to the movement outside. A moment later, the door was opened and closed, and everything was quiet again. Who came in? Only his secretary had a room card in his room. Xing Yihan resisted the heat in his lower body that was about to explode. His handsome face was so gloomy that water was about to drip out. He suddenly turned off the shower, raised his hand to grab a bathrobe, and put it on. Then, he opened the door and walked out expressionlessly. The room was still the same as before he went in to take a shower. The light was dim, and the curtains were closed. He glanced coldly in the direction of the door, turned around, and was about to pick up the cell phone on the bedside, but at the moment his eyes fell on the bed, he suddenly saw a bulge in the quilt in the middle of the bed. Obviously, someone was lying in the quilt. He fixed his eyes on it, walked to the bed with a cold face, and mercilessly lifted the quilt. However, the moment he lifted the quilt, there was a flash of lightning outside the window, and a cold lightning flashed outside the window, making his brain, which had just been forcibly calmed down by the cold water, almost explode in an instant. On the large white bed, the woman in the gown was lying on it. Her long hair was disheveled, and her fair cheeks were abnormally red. Her eyes were closed quietly, as if she was asleep, or in other words, in a coma. The scene that kept appearing in his mind just now gradually overlapped with the woman lying quietly on the bed in front of him. Xing Yihan stared at Jin Wan on the bed for a long time, gradually put down the quilt he had just lifted, and threw it to the other side of the bed. Who secretly planned all this, who knew that he had a deep love for Jin Wan for many years, and who tried to make Jin Wan faint and send her to his bed? There was no need to guess the answer. Ji Mengran had been driven out of control these days. She wanted to destroy Jin Wan. She wanted to destroy Jin Wan with him. Normally, Xing Yihan would never be used by Ji Mengran. But now, his only weakness was right in front of him. Destroying her was equivalent to destroying himself. It was just mutual destruction, so what was wrong with that? Xing Yihan stood by the bed for a while, slowly stretched out his hand, and gently touched the woman's fair and blushing face. That spring festival many years ago, on the Ji family sofa, the scene of him pressing her down on the sofa under the influence of alcohol and almost ripping off her clothes came back to his mind again. The softness of pressing her under his body and holding her in his arms, the feeling that was as smooth as porcelain, and the endless desire he had for this woman since many years ago. As the heat in his lower body rose again, it gnawed at his rationality again and again. In particular, the woman on the bed was too quiet. She was not as distant, cold, and disgusted as she usually was when she saw him. She was still so fair and smooth. Her thick and long eyelashes lay quietly under her eyelids, and her breathing was even. She was like a princess who had accidentally fallen asleep because she had bitten a poisonous apple, waiting for her man to kiss her awake. The woman who had haunted his mind for so many years, the reason why he hated other women so much, was the one in front of him. She lay there obediently. Should he do it? He had drugged her. From her face, he could tell she had also been drugged, but he didn't know how the other party had made her fall asleep. But as long as he had her tonight, even if Mo Jingshan could tolerate her for one night and still love her in the palm of his hand, given Jin Wan's character, it was impossible for her to return to Mo Jingshan's side. And if he guessed right, the media had been informed and would definitely wait outside the room tonight or tomorrow morning, waiting to capture the scene of Mrs. Mo having an affair. None of this would harm his interests except that it would directly offend Mo Jingshan. But it was not the first time that he had provoked Mo Jingshan. If he was really afraid of the Mo family, he wouldn't be Xing Yihan today. Jin Wan. This name, as well as this seductive, crimson face when she was asleep, kept replaying in his mind and in front of his eyes. Little by little, Xing Yihan's reason was hollowed out by the scorching heat under him. Even if after this night, he still couldn't get anything except her body, he still wanted it very much. The man lowered his head and slowly approached the woman on the bed. This woman should have belonged to him. When they were in the Ji family, he shouldn't have felt pity for her. He should have taken her as his own early. Maybe in the future, there would be no story between her and Mo Jingshan. Even if he was hated, at least he would be the one who entangled with her for the rest of his life. Just when Xing Yihan's thin lips were about to fall on the woman's red lips, Jin Wan suddenly woke up from her sleep. Before she could react, she saw the man's face right in front of her. She trembled in fright and instinctively turned her face to the side. The man's kiss didn't land on her lips, but it brushed past the corner of her mouth and landed a kiss on it. Seeing the woman who had been sleeping suddenly move, the fire in Xing Yihan's eyes suddenly burned fiercely. He lowered his eyes and stared at her. The moment Jin Wan was kissed on the corner of her mouth, all her hair stood on end. Before she had time to think about what had happened, she only remembered that in the dim light of the banquet hall, someone seemed to cover her mouth, and then there was a pungent smell. Then she knew nothing. But she didn't expect that the moment she woke up, it was Xing Yihan she saw. The nightmare she had in the Ji family when she was a teenager seemed to come back to her mind in an instant. Her whole body tensed up, and when the man who leaned over to kiss her paused, she abruptly turned her eyes and looked at him defensively. "Did you order someone to drug me?" Chapter 647. Jin Wan's eyes were still a little confused. She could only recognize that the person in front of her was Xing Yihan, but after she woke up, she felt a heat in her body that seemed to have been suppressed for a long time because she had been in a coma. She had been drugged before, so she immediately knew what was going on. Jin Wan hurriedly sat up in bed, but perhaps because she had been forced to inhale too much of the drug, she only got up for a moment before lying back down feebly. She could only watch Xing Yihan standing by the bed and looking down at her as if watching a weak person struggling in a cage. She immediately clutched the sheets under her and glared at him coldly. "How dare you drug me? Xing Yihan, I know you are despicable and shameless, but now you are so shameless that it disgusts me." Xing Yihan smiled and accepted her scolding, but his hand gently stroked her face. Jin Wan stiffened all over because of his touch. The man's hand was also shockingly hot, but she only felt as if there was a cold viper crawling on her face, and this snake was even spitting its tongue at her, swearing that he might succeed tonight. It made her shudder. With my status, if I didn't live a despicable and shameless life, how could I control the entire Xing family? The man whispered hoarsely and slowly bent down. "Jin Wan, you should have been my woman a long time ago." Just as his hand was about to touch her lips, Jin Wan suddenly opened her mouth and bit hard on his finger. Xing Yihan didn't move. Even though he was in pain and bleeding from her bite, he still didn't rush to withdraw his hand. Instead, he put another finger into her mouth and patiently teased her tongue. There was blood on his finger in Jin Wan's mouth, and she was so disgusted by his action that she spat out his hand. She sat up on the bed with an ugly face and could only shrink back a little with the little strength she had. Finally, she leaned against the headboard and curled up, her eyes full of wariness and alienation. "I'm warning you, stop. Don't be so heartless. If you dare to touch me, I'll definitely hack you to pieces." However, as soon as Jin Wan finished speaking, the man got on the bed and slowly approached her like a beast lurking in the night. When Jin Wan tightened her body and looked at him in disbelief, he had come up to her. He looked down at the woman on the bed and smiled. The heat in his eyes did not diminish at all but seemed to burn even more fiercely. "How do you want to cut it? Like this?" Xing Yihan's kiss fell on her chin. Jin Wan hurriedly turned her face away, so he only kissed her chin. But the next moment, the man moved up and was about to kiss her lips accurately and firmly. The nightmare she had almost forgotten pierced her reason like needles. Jin Wan screamed and raised her hand to push the man away. When Xing Yihan's face was very close to hers, she desperately pushed against him and let out a low, trembling cry like a trapped beast. Don't. If the man in front of her was someone else, she wouldn't be so panicked, but this man was Xing Yihan, the Xing Yihan who almost pressed her down on the sofa of the Ji family and raped her when she was a teenager. It was the Xing Yihan who scared her so much that she ran to stand under a tree in winter for a whole night and finally got cold all over. "Go away." Jin Wan pushed him and tried to get out of the bed, but Xing Yihan ignored her resistance and bent down to press her down. Jin Wan hurriedly rolled away on the bed with all her strength at the moment he pressed her down, and when the man reached out to grab her back, she continued to roll away hard. She rolled off the edge of the bed and fell heavily on the ground. The pain made her bite her lip hard. She struggled to support herself on the ground with her injured arm and slowly sat up. The moment she got up, she saw Xing Yihan sitting on the bed in only a bathrobe. His eyes were playful, passionate, and as if he was watching her, who was destined to be unable to escape tonight, looking at her flustered look. He seemed to be watching a good show, and the playful look in his eyes made Jin-Wan burst into anger. She grabbed the high-heeled shoes that someone had taken off her feet and threw them hard at his face. Xing Yihan didn't dodge. The shoes hit him on the shoulder and fell to the side of the bed, making a muffled sound. Seeing that he was not threatening at all, Jin-Wan staggered to her feet, put her hands on the edge of the bed, and then turned to support herself on the table beside the bed. She looked for the door, took 2 steps forward, and tried to escape. However, just as Jin-Wan staggered a few steps toward the door, her waist suddenly tightened, and she was suddenly pulled back by the man's arm. At the same time, he held her firmly in his arms. The man's hot breath was pressed against the back of her neck, and he said hoarsely, "Don't struggle. I said the door has been locked from the outside. Do you believe me? Let me go." Jin-Wan struggled desperately in his arms. "Don't touch me. Let me go. Let me go, oh. Oh, oh." Jin-Wan felt that Xing Yihan's lips were touching her from the back of her neck to the exposed back and shoulders of the gown, and her stomach was churning with waves of nausea. She kept struggling, using both hands and feet, but her mouth was covered and she couldn't speak. She tried to bite him several times, but he covered her mouth so hard that she couldn't open her mouth at all. "Oh! Oh!" The zipper on the back of the gown suddenly made a swish. It was the sound of the gown being pulled open. Jin-Wan trembled all over and hurriedly began a new round of desperate struggle, only to be abruptly thrown onto the bed by Xing Yihan. The moment Jin-Wan fell onto the bed, she hurriedly crawled to the side, only to be pulled back by the ankle by the man, who then bent down and pressed her under his body. Chapter 648. When Jin-Wan almost cried out, Xing Yihan was confused by her fragile appearance for a moment and didn't notice that Jin-Wan had bent her legs when he was not paying attention. Xing Yihan's lower body was suddenly hit hard by her knee. He groaned in pain and froze on top of her. Jin-Wan looked at the man whose face suddenly turned pale with tears and pushed him away with all her strength. When Xing Yihan reached out to grab her back to the bed, she rolled to the edge of the bed again, staggered to the ground, and slowly stood up. While he was in pain and couldn't get up so quickly, she moved to the door as quickly as possible. But when she reached the door, Jin-Wan tugged at the door lock in a panic, only to find that the door was really locked from the outside. Locked from the outside? She forced herself to calm down and regain some rationality. The temperature on Xing Yihan's body was also unusual, and the door was locked from the outside, which meant that she had been sent in without his knowledge. He was also drugged. Even if the door couldn't be opened, Jin-Wan immediately let go of the door lock, leaned stiffly against the door, and didn't even knock on the door to ask for help. The man on the bed slowly sat up and turned to look at the blushing and shocked woman leaning against the door. After a few glances, he chuckled hoarsely and said in a hoarse voice, "I told you, the door was locked from the outside, but you didn't believe me." Hearing his voice, Jin-Wan shivered instinctively and turned to look at him. "Is it Ji Mengran? The person who understands my feelings for you and wants to use me to destroy you? Other than her, there can't be anyone else," Xing Yihan said as he slowly got out of bed. His eyes were still filled with desire that could almost swallow her. He approached her step by step. "This door can't be opened even if it can. You should have guessed that there may be reporters and media people outside the door at any time. Once you and I are photographed in the same room, both disheveled and blushing, Mo Jingshan's head will be put on a big green hat." Jin-Wan watched as he approached her, leaning hard against the door. Her heart felt as though a large piece of emptiness had fallen into her heart. Mo Jingshan had just said in front of the media that she was Mrs. Mo, and this news was still very popular. Almost everyone who read the news said that CEO Mo's public display of affection was too delicious, and there were too many people who envied and hated Jean Wan as Mrs. Mo. If she was photographed coming out of a man's room like this, even Mo Jingshan wouldn't be able to save her. If that happened, even Mo Jingshan would not be able to save her and might even drag him down with her. Just as Jean Wan clenched her fists, Xing Yihan had come over. Breathing in the man's scent, Jean Wan shivered again. You were drugged, weren't you? You wouldn't do such a stupid thing when you're sober. Don't tell me you're willing to be used by Ji Mengran? He chuckled, leaned down, and put his hand on the door behind her. He lowered his eyes to look at her red and guarded little face. Of course I won't let her use me, but the woman who was sent to my bed is you, so I can only accept her kindness. Jean Wan raised her hand against his chest as he approached her as he spoke. Her mind was in a trance and she almost lost control of herself to hold the man who had brought her countless nightmares. The impulse to tear off her clothes made her heart fall to the bottom of the abyss. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and forced herself to stay rational. She pushed him hard again. However, not only did he not push her, but Xing Yihan even turned his arm, which had just been propped against the door panel behind her, around her waist, drew her into his arms, and bent down to kiss her neck. Jean Wan's hair and goosebumps rose all over. She kept resisting, but he held her tightly in his arms. Jean Wan. Xing Yihan held her firmly, and his voice was hoarse and almost intoxicated in her neck. I've loved you for so many years, but I couldn't get your heart. If I take away everything that belongs to you in the Ji family, at least you'll always hate me. At least you'll still have an inch of space for me in your heart. At least you won't forget me no matter how many years have passed. You lunatic. Let me go. But you're right in front of me. Even if I don't have this drug, I can't let you go as long as you're lying in my bed like this, let alone in this situation. How can I let you go? Xing Yihan's voice was hoarse, so hoarse that it made her flustered, but his burning hands still held her waist tightly. Since we're dragging each other down, even after tonight, when I destroy you, it's the same as destroying me. I won't regret it, Xing Yihan, wake up. Jean Wan felt that he was crazy. He must be crazy. However, at this moment, the man pressed his lips against her ear, and the hot breath from his mouth entered her earlobe. I'm very sober, Jean Wan. I know very well how you've become a terrible nightmare over the years. You've always existed in my dreams, making me feel disgusted with other women except for you in my dreams. Now that the real you is in front of me, how can I not enjoy it? Xing Yihan's words seemed affectionate, but the more Jean Wan listened, the more she trembled. When did she become his nightmare? He was clearly her biggest nightmare many years ago. When she heard that he had touched her in his dreams, she felt even more disgusted and frightened. She raised her leg and was about to attack his lower body again. This time, Xing Yihan was prepared. He pressed her leg with one hand and put the other hand into her unzipped back. As soon as his hand touched her smooth and white back, Jean Wan suddenly trembled and screamed as if she was about to explode, "Don't touch me." Perhaps because Jean Wan's voice was too sad and shrill, Xing Yihan's hand paused. Taking advantage of this pause, Jean Wan was about to push him away, but she suddenly felt a pain on her neck. Xing Yihan suddenly bit her on the neck. Jean Wan fought back the pain, but it was this kind of pain that kept her sober. She looked around sharply and caught a glimpse of a transparent crystal ashtray on the table shelf not far from the window. Chapter 649. Xing Yihan narrowed his eyes because of the pain and numbness in his calf. At the moment he froze, Jean Wan attacked his other calf. He thought she was going to attack his lower body, but he didn't expect her to attack his calf again. This time, even though he raised his hand to dodge in time, he failed to dodge and was successfully kicked by Jean Wan. A strange pain and numbness came from his calf bones. You. Xing Yihan didn't expect Jean Wan to be so skilled. In his memory, she hadn't learned any self-defense skills. Even if she had, she couldn't be so skilled. However, Jinwan didn't even look at him. She gritted her teeth and pushed him away. When Xingyihan was temporarily unable to support himself because of the pain and numbness in his legs, she pushed him back 2 steps. At the moment she successfully got out of his arms, Jinwan was grateful to Feng Ling for what she had taught her. At first, she only learned the acupoints on the upper body, including the hands and arms. However, before leaving London, Feng Ling spent another week teaching her the acupoints on the legs. However, because she learned in a hurry, Jinwan had never used this method. Earlier, she was just taking a gamble. She didn't expect that she would really kick the right place. However, Xingyihan used to be an orthopedic doctor. After being shocked by Jinwan's trick of attacking the acupoints on the calf, he calmed down in less than half a minute. After confirming that there would be no problem except the pain in his legs, he saw that Jinwan had rushed to the window, and the tightly closed curtains fluttered slightly because of her rushing speed. What was she doing there? She couldn't go out of the door. Was she going to jump out of the window? This was the 10th floor of the hotel. As soon as this idea came to his mind, Xingyihan suddenly endured the pain and hurried over. Jinwan. Come back. The man's legs were too long. Jinwan rushed to the table in front of the window and leaned against it to adjust her breathing, which was disorderly because of the drug, when he came over in 3 or 4 steps. He grabbed her arm and brought her back into his arms. At the same time, he pressed her tightly in his arms. Even if you break my legs today, I won't let go of you. Don't struggle. I don't know how much drug was put in the wine. At least you want it now, don't you? Jinwan's hand reached back, clutched the corner of the table, and said in a trembling voice, Xingyihan, I'll give you one last chance. Let go of me. Don't touch me. However, the man chuckled at her weak threat, as though he thought she was too naive. He bent down and kissed her ear. At the same time, he said resolutely, Tonight, here, you are mine. Before he finished his words, Jinwan's hand had mercilessly swung down on his head. With a muffled sound of a heavy object hitting his skull, Xingyihan suddenly stiffened all over. Jinwan leaned against the table, trembling all over, watching the man who had been holding her tightly slowly let go of his hand on her back, took a look at her in disbelief, and then slowly fell down until he fell heavily to the ground. The moment he fell to the ground, Xingyihan could hardly speak. His eyes were fixed on the heavy crystal ashtray in Jinwan's hand. Seeing the obvious blood on the corner of the ashtray and Jinwan trembling but still holding the ashtray, he stared at her for a long time until the dim light blurred and he closed his eyes. Jinwan looked at the man who fell heavily to the ground. Just now, she had put all her strength into her hand to hit him, hitting the back of his head. She didn't know whether she had hit him hard or not, but seeing such a tall man like Xingyihan suddenly fall to the ground, and then seeing his white bathrobe, which was almost dyed red by the blood flowing from the back of his head, Jinwan trembled and threw the ashtray to the ground. Her hands and feet were weak, and she staggered to the ground, almost unable to get up. Did she kill someone? She didn't figure out the acupuncture point on the back of his head just now. She didn't know whether it would be fatal or not, but she had no other way to protect herself. She had given him a chance. She couldn't tell what kind of fear surrounded her in an instant. Jinwan's teeth were chattering with fear. Seeing more and more blood flowing from the back of his head and the shocking blood-stained bathrobe behind his shoulders, Jinwan sat on the ground and kept backing away slowly until she reached the curtains. Leaning against the cold window, she forced herself to calm down. However, the fear that filled the sky and the crazily intertwined fiery desire in her body almost burned her up. She almost forgot when was the last time she was drugged. However, the effect at that time was obviously not as powerful as this time. In the past 3 years, even this medicine had been improved by who knew how many times. She leaned against the window to calm down for a long time, but the smell of blood in her nose still made endless fear surround her. She didn't dare to look at Xingyihan on the ground, and didn't know how long he had been lying motionless and unconscious. Thinking about it, she felt that even if she did it to protect herself, it was also a crime to kill him. She took a breath, put her hand on the window behind her, and stood up little by little. Then she began to look for the landline in the room, only to find that the phone line had been cut off. Did Ji Mengran cut it off when she was sent in? To prevent her from calling for help? She didn't even know where her cell phone was now. Jean Wan's legs were weak, and the feeling of emptiness and warmth in her lower body made her so weak that she almost fell on the bed, and she couldn't help making some uncontrollable sounds. She raised her hand and bit her finger hard, forcing herself to stay awake, and at the same time, she looked around for the clothes Xing Yihan had changed before he took a shower. When she found his shirt and trousers, she quickly rushed over and took out his cell phone. Even if his cell phone had a password, in this case, she could call the emergency police. She quickly dialed 110, but she couldn't explain clearly that both of them were drugged and that there might be reporters outside. She only said that someone here was injured and needed help immediately, or he might die. After hanging up the phone, she didn't know if the police would take this matter seriously or send someone immediately, but now she had no choice but to wait. Chapter 650. It was just a simple action of unzipping the zipper, but it made her feel hotter all over. She didn't know how long she could hold on. She even had an unconscious thought that even if the man lying on the ground was like a nightmare to her, he was still very tempting to her. After all, he was a man. She continued to bite her fingers, only to find that even the pain was useless. She took a deep breath, staggered to her feet, and rushed into the bathroom. She turned on the shower head and quickly changed the cold water to blue. It wasn't until the ice-cold water drenched her heart that she finally felt the terrifying heat being suppressed a little. However, there was also a certain kind of heat that was slowly drilling out of her body, forming a terrible feeling of alternating hot and cold with the ice-cold outside of her body. The heat seemed to want to drill out of her body, as if two mutually contending things were constantly tearing at the surface of her skin, and the one who was hurt and feeling the pain was her own body. Jean Wan didn't know how long she had been tortured by this terrible alternating hot and cold. Various vivid scenes kept appearing in her mind. She raised her head and let the cold water wash her face. She leaned against the wall weakly and bumped her head back again and again in vain, as if even this pain couldn't compare to the pain of the cold and hot tearing on the surface of her skin. While Jean Wan was being tortured in the bathroom of the hotel room, several reporters who had been contacted by Ji Mengran had been waiting outside the room. There seemed to be some sound coming from the room for a while, but now there was no movement. These reporters were all new newspapers and magazines from small underground workshops. They had nothing to do with other large media and did their jobs as long as they were paid. There were 4 or 5 of them in total. Seeing that there was no movement, someone directly called Ji Mengran. "Hello, second Miss G, there has been no movement for a long time. I don't know if it has been done. Would you like to come and see for yourself? I know it's not convenient for you to show up, second Miss G, but this is a critical moment. Are we afraid of making mistakes? After all, if you want to ruin Jean Wan with this kind of thing, we have to listen to your instructions." The person who was on the phone was about to speak, when suddenly, a low and cold voice rang from the corner of the VIP elevator in the corridor. "Ruin Jean Wan? How many lives do you have?" For the first time, there was such a voice that made these reporters, who had always been good at secretly filming all kinds of entertainment stars' cheating scandals or rich and powerful scandals, feel a sense of fear in their hearts. A few reporters who were hiding in the corner with cameras immediately looked in that direction. Perhaps it was because the man's black clothes were cold from the autumn night, or perhaps it was because the man was walking toward them. His gaze paused on the room Jean Wan was trapped in, and his cold aura caused one's heart to tremble. Nothing should have happened to the banquet Jean Wan attended tonight. After all, it was a charity banquet arranged by the city leaders. No one in their right mind would play tricks on such an occasion. However, Ji Mengran was different. When she was forced into a corner, she dared to use any despicable means to destroy her own path of retreat. After learning that there was a power outage at the end of the banquet, Jin-won disappeared. In less than an hour, on the way to the hotel where the incident happened, he suddenly learned that there was something wrong with some of the red wine at the banquet tonight. Many of the glasses had been drugged. From that moment on, Mo Jingshan's eyes were surging with a murderous intent. It was as though there were no visible waves in his eyes. The reporters were shocked that Mo Jingshan would actually arrive. They all rushed to stand up from the corner, only to see the man's handsome face. His features were cold and deep, and his face was extremely expressionless. When he walked past the reporters, he coldly ordered the person behind him, "Take them away." Then he glanced at them, stepped on the cameras that were instantly smashed to the ground in the reporters' hands, and walked straight toward the door. Shenmue promptly snatched the room card from a reporter's hand and the key to the directional lock that only hotel staff could use, and quickly walked over to hand them to Mo Jingshan. The moment the door was opened, a pungent smell of blood wafted over. The first thing Mo Jingshan saw was Xing Yihan lying motionless on the carpet inside and the places on his body that had been dyed red with blood. Shenmue also saw this scene the moment he stepped in, and his expression immediately changed to one of shock. Mo Jingshan coldly glanced at the man on the ground who he didn't know was dead or alive. Hearing the sound of water in the bathroom, he decisively stepped into the bathroom. The moment he opened the door, Jin-won was kneeling on the ground in a sorry state. The cold water kept pouring down on her head, making the air in the bathroom cold. The little woman's face was pale from the cold water, and her lips were bloodless. She frowned and closed her eyes as if she was enduring great pain. The obvious bite mark on her neck had become red and swollen from being washed by the water for too long. Jin-won was still trapped in the torment of alternating hot and cold. All of a sudden, the cold water above her head was turned off. She opened her eyes in confusion and vaguely saw a familiar black figure in front of her. A warm hand suddenly touched her wet head to prevent her from hitting the wall mechanically. At the same time, the man's low voice that seemed to be full of heartache rang in her ears. "Don't hit me again." She opened her eyes, but because her mind was no longer clear, she suspected that she was hallucinating. She even suspected that what she saw was just an illusion. She did not move, but frowned and said in a hoarse voice, "No matter who you are, don't touch me." Seeing that she couldn't stay awake at all, Mo Jingshan was about to pick her up from the ground, but the moment the man held her waist, Jin-won suddenly trembled as if she had been electrocuted. Had Xing Yihan woken up? What else did he want to do? She hurriedly struggled. "Don't touch me. Let go. Don't touch me." She screamed hoarsely and lowered her head to bite his arm. Mo Jingshan was bitten, but he held her tighter and decisively lifted her up from the cold, wet tile floor. He bent down and kissed her comfortingly on her wet forehead. He pressed his lips against her forehead and gently said, "Don't be afraid. It's me. Let go, don't hold me, don't touch me, don't." Jin-won waved her hands and feet as if she couldn't hear him. Chapter 651. Jin-won's desperate struggle froze as her face was forcefully pressed against his chest. Her 5 senses seemed to have been catalyzed by the drug, and it was as though she could not feel anything except for her sense of smell. At the very least, the moment she pressed against his chest, she caught a whiff of the unique, cold, and floral fragrance that only Mo Jingshan had on his body. By her ear was the man's patient, gentle voice, "It's me. Don't be afraid, Mo Jingshan." Jin-won's stiff body seemed to soften in an instant. She shrank weakly in his arms, letting the man carry her steadily. She pressed her head against his chest and deeply breathed in his scent as if she was repeatedly confirming whether he was Mo Jingshan or not. The man was about to carry her out of the bathroom when he suddenly heard a sobbing voice in his arms, "Mo Jingshan." Perhaps it was this voice, or perhaps it was because the woman in his arms was too hot, but the man's eyes deepened. It had been too long since he heard Jin-won call his name in such a soft and dependent voice, and it had been too long since he felt such a strong need from her. Mo Jingshan didn't expect that he had plotted for so many years just to let her live well. Even if the price he had to pay was that she wouldn't forgive or understand him, even if he could no longer have her, he would gladly endure it. He had long guessed and accepted the price, but in fact, what he was really waiting for was the day she was willing to turn back, the day she was willing to lean against him like this. Lowering his eyes to look at the little woman in his arms whose pale cheeks gradually revealed a bit of a charming blush, Mo Jingshan's voice became hoarse when he opened his mouth to reply, "Is it very uncomfortable?" Jean Wan raised her hand. Her fingers were still trembling. She tremblingly grabbed the collar of his shirt. "I don't want to. Stay here. All right, let's go home." Mo Jingshan carried Jean Wan out of the bathroom. Before leaving, the man paused. Out of the corner of his eyes, he coldly looked at the person on the ground whose bathrobe was half stained with blood and then at the mess in the room. He coldly ordered, "Shenmu, clean it up." "All right." Shenmu stood aside and nodded cautiously. He knew very well how much self-control CEO Mo had to keep from kicking Xing Yihan out of the window on the 10th floor. After what happened tonight, not only would the Xing family's name be removed from High City, but even the reporters who were paid to do their jobs would not be able to see the light of day. Most people who dared to provoke Mo Jingshan could still be saved, but those who dared to drug Jean Wan and send her to Xing Yihan's room were really tired of living. Back then, after Zhou Yanyan drugged Jean Wan, Zhou Yanyan's fate was turned upside down. In the end, the Zhou family and the forces behind the Zhou family were turned upside down. Zhou Yanyan was tortured for 2 months and finally died tragically on the way abroad while being escorted by her family. Jean Wan didn't know what had happened behind the scenes, but it could be seen that this time, Ji Mengran had really knocked into the muzzle of the gun. The public opinion had ruined her reputation, disqualified her from inheriting the Ji Corporation's assets, and caused the studio's funds to be frozen overnight. This was only a small punishment. Now, she was using the worst methods on Jean Wan. Even if, she would end up like Zhou Yanyan, or even worse. CEO Mo, what about Xing Yihan? Shenmu paused and finally asked. Mo Jingshan lowered his eyes and looked at the woman in his arms, who had been cold because of the water but now gradually became hot again. Jean Wan's dress was still on her body, but it was wet and heavy and uncomfortable. The man's slender and well-defined fingers gently touched the place on her neck where Xing Yihan had bitten her, and the coldness that flashed across his eyes was too obvious. Without saying a word, he turned sideways in front of the door with Jean Wan in his arms and walked out. The room was quiet and full of the smell of blood. Shenmu saw the killing intent hidden under the surface of the iceberg in Mo Jingshan's eyes, but because it was Jean Wan who attacked him, even if Xing Yihan deserved to die, he couldn't let her take his life. Otherwise, even if Mo Jingshan had the ability to correct Jean Wan's behavior as self-defense, Jean Wan herself would collapse. These things had to be dealt with first. Half an hour later, Aolan International. Hearing the sound of the password-protected door, Jean Wan opened her eyes with difficulty, only to see the man's handsome face and the password-protected door open. At a glance, she recognized where this place was. She bit her lip. On the way to the car, she almost couldn't help pouncing on this man, but there was a driver in the car, and Mo Jingshan had been holding her, so she couldn't control herself and could only rub back and forth in his arms. However, there were times when she sobered up. She couldn't stand her unrestrained behavior and bit her lips several times to sober up, but her lips bled and the heat in her body didn't fade. When the man carried her into the house and put her on the sofa, Jean Wan was sober. She told herself to calm down, but her hands still clung to the man's neck uncontrollably and refused to let go. Her face was buried deep in his shoulder, and she kept moaning in pain. Because of her strength, Mo Jingshan was forced to fall down with her when he put her on the sofa. He looked at her blushing face and his eyes darkened. "It's okay. You won't feel uncomfortable in a while, En?" Jean Wan didn't know what he was going to do. The man held her waist with one hand to prevent her from moving because of insecurity and picked up his cell phone with the other hand to call Qin Sighting. The call went through, but it was very noisy on the other side. Qin Sighting was obviously not at home or in the hospital. Mo Jingshan asked seriously, Jean Wan was drugged. If she doesn't go to the hospital, will she have any problems? Qin Sighting. That drug? Mo Jingshan looked at the woman under him who was obviously suffering. He wasn't sure how severe the drug Ji Mengran had drugged her, but he knew it was not simple from her state. Qin Sighting immediately came to himself, walked to a quiet place, and chuckled. That kind of drug usually doesn't harm the body, and it's useless to go to the hospital. She seems to be lying obediently without struggling or moving, but her body is also suffering when she falls asleep. It's just that others can't see her movements, so instead of going to the hospital and asking the doctor to give her a tranquilizer to deceive herself, it's better to solve it at home. Anyway, she's your woman. The easiest way is to accompany her for a night. Don't tell me you're so reserved at this time. Chapter 652. It's just something with an aphrodisiac effect. There's a difference between an increased dose and a normal dose. If we're talking about harm, Jean Wan was drugged, but the one who's harmed is you. After all, if she was drugged with an extremely large dose, you'd have to be mentally prepared to fight for a day and a night. She might keep pestering you for it. Mo Jingshan's voice was heavy. Did I call just to listen to your nonsense? Who knows what type of drug your woman was drugged with? This kind of thing is too common in the black market abroad and in the country. Even if you go to the hospital for a blood test, it'll take at least 1 or 2 hours for the results to come out. In the end, it'll still be the same drug, and she'll have to suffer for so long for nothing. TSK, don't tell me you're afraid that if you take advantage of her while she's unconscious, she'll fall out with you when she wakes up. Mo Jingshan, you actually have times when you're so apprehensive? If you're really afraid she'll fall out with you, there's only one way. Throw her into a cold bathtub for a night. Remember to put some ice in the bathtub every hour, but the price is that after the drug wears off, she might get frostbite or catch a serious cold. Mo Jingshan cursed softly, hung up the phone, and threw it to the side. When he lowered his head, he saw the little woman lying on the sofa. Her cheeks were red and delicate, and her eyes were blurry and wet. The wet gown stuck to her body, making her look extremely disheveled, but it also added to her seductiveness. Any normal man who saw this scene would most likely tear off her gown and strip her clean. Of course, Mo Jingshan was normal. When this little woman kept twisting in his arms in the car, if it weren't for his strong self-control, he most likely would have pressed her against the car and made her his from the inside out. He would have carved his mark on her body and into her bones. Not to mention such a scene right now. Her gown stuck to her body and outlined the contours of her body. She didn't even notice that one of the straps had fallen off. Her long hair fell on her shoulders and back like seaweed. She lay on the sofa and looked at him with teary eyes. This woman hadn't looked at him with such a seductive gaze for a long time. Her cheeks were white and rosy, and she was so beautiful that she couldn't be compared to anyone else. Every inch of her was a signal that beckoned for him to ruthlessly ravage her. And Mo Jingshan lowered his eyes to look at her. His Adam's apple bobbed, and his long legs pressed down her mischievous legs that kept moving. His long and strong fingers held the woman's chin, and he lowered his head to give a soothing kiss between her eyebrows. Just as Jean Wan raised her head to take the initiative to kiss him, she found that his kiss only fell on her forehead. Her body and heart were inexplicably wrapped around her, making her writhe unhappily under him. The little woman's hands had already unconsciously climbed up his shirt. Her hot and soft fingers were randomly pulling at the buttons of his shirt, but there was no order to her actions. Mo Jingshan chuckled softly, raising his hand to hold her hand that was acting wildly on his body. Even though he knew that she was not sober enough, he still patiently hung over her. He bent down and pressed his forehead against hers, speaking huskily, "I've said it before. In the future, as long as I don't get your permission, I definitely won't act recklessly. Be obedient and don't seduce me, N." The man's tone was very deliberate. Hearing his words, her heart immediately surged with anger. When she was drunk and had a fever, he could do it with her all night, and now he actually said such words to her? Did he really think that she couldn't remember anything now that she was unconscious? She abruptly stopped moving back and forth under him. Anyway, she knew that this was Aeolon International, so she wasn't completely unconscious. She just had to endure the discomfort. Compared to being deliberately kept in suspense by this man and finally begging him to bully her, her face was more important. If you don't want it, then don't. Jean Wan closed her eyes and no longer looked at him. She treated the man on top of her as a pig's head, as a creature that was not a man, to maintain her composure. However, her voice was still panting as she said hoarsely, "I've been drugged. Otherwise, do you think I would beg you?" He lowered his head to look at her expression of wanting to save face no matter what and smiled thinly. "Are you sure?" "I don't want it. If I really can't take it anymore, at most." She paused and gritted her teeth before saying, "There's an adult toy shop downstairs. I'll ask someone to buy something to replace it." Mo Jingshan knew that she was being forced into a corner and could not help but laugh. "Am I not more comfortable than that kind of thing?" Earlier, Jean Wan was already extreme enough to say those words. Hearing that he was actually laughing, she was so angry that she raised her hand to slap his face. In any case, she was even capable of killing someone with an ashtray tonight. What was there to be afraid of? Mo Jingshan easily caught her wrist and pressed it against the sofa by her head. Jean Wan's entire body was burning up, but her mind was trying hard to remind herself that this bastard was Mo Jingshan. She had clearly blacklisted him on WeChat earlier. Right now, even if she had to hold it in, she definitely would not do it with him. Should I praise you for having such great willpower? Even in such a situation, you don't forget to be angry at me. What willpower? It's not like I can't endure this bit of drug. You've already endured it. How can I not endure it? Jean Wan widened her eyes to look at him. Her breathing was hurried, and her voice was still trembling like silk. Besides, even if you didn't rush over to save me tonight, wouldn't I still be able to endure a night of soaking in cold water? Don't think that just because you helped me again, I'll beg you with tears of gratitude. Mo Jingshan, don't even think about it. Faced with Jean Wan's stubbornness, Mo Jingshan did not speak further. Instead, he directly carried the woman on the sofa horizontally. What are you doing? Jean Wan's body was once again suspended in the air. The desire in her body that she had tried so hard to suppress leapt up again. Her entire body trembled in his arms, and the moisture in her eyes deepened. The man carried her in the direction of the bathroom. If you don't want it, I can't really force you. Do you mean that soaking in cold water is very comfortable? Jean Wan, in any case, it's more comfortable than you using it. He smiled mildly. Very good. These two words caused Jean Wan's scalp to turn numb. She suspected that Mo Jingshan was about to unleash his beastly heart and press her into the bathtub to fondle her. Although her heart was very resistant, her body was very obedient and expectant. Chapter 653. However, to Jean Wan's relief, Mo Jingshan didn't do anything to her but put her into the bathtub with her clothes still on. First, the cold water poured down from the top of her head. Jean Wan had just returned from the cold shower in the hotel, but now that she was suddenly drenched in cold water again, she subconsciously cried out in surprise. However, the cold water was adjusted to warm water, and the man's voice came from above her head. Do you want cold water or warm water? Mo Jingshan was not standing within the range of the shower, so the water didn't touch his clothes. Only the rising steam obscured her vision, and she could only see the man's black shirt when she raised her head. Warm water. Jean Wan shivered in the water. The warm water gradually increased in the bathtub. Although it wasn't as unbearably cold as cold water, the warmth of the warm water caused her body temperature to rise. Previously in the hotel room, she was afraid that she couldn't control herself, so she took a cold shower. Now, she didn't want herself to catch a cold or have a fever the next day. She would rather warm herself in the warm water to prevent her body from catching a cold than soak in cold water again. Then, hearing the man's movement, Jinwan turned to see that Jingxian seemed to be going out. She subconsciously grabbed the edge of the bathtub and asked him, "Where are you going?" The man paused and did not turn back. "Didn't you say that you didn't want me to touch you? Soaking in the water is good for relieving tension. I can't stand here and watch you wriggle like a snake in the water. Otherwise, I'm afraid I can't be a saint." Jinwan, his words seemed to make sense, but strangely, she felt wronged. Jinwan felt that this medicine was definitely not something good. It could even control her IQ. Seeing that the man was really going to leave, she grabbed a towel by the side and threw it harshly at the man's back. Jingxian let her vent, speaking softly in the still pitter-patter of the bathtub, "Be good and soak in the water for a night. You know the bathtub has an automatic water temperature adjustment function. Remember to adjust the temperature yourself, N?" Jinwan watched his back with red eyes. Jingxian, I feel so uncomfortable right now. I'm about to explode." He then turned his head to look at her indifferently. "I know. So what do you want? To go to the hospital?" Of course, she wouldn't go to the hospital. She had probably heard part of the call he had made to Qin sighting. Putting aside the fact that it would be embarrassing to go to the hospital with this kind of medicine, it would be useless even if she went. The doctor would only give her a tranquilizer. "No," she said firmly. "Well, let's soak then." With that, the man was about to leave. Jingxian. Jinwan's hand was still gripping the bathtub tightly. He had already opened the bathroom door. Without turning his head, he said, "Occasionally, I'll let you have a taste of the fire of desire. It's only fair that you can see but not eat." Fair? What did it have to do with her that he was usually burning with desire? It wasn't like she took the initiative to seduce him. How could this be considered fair? Jinwan stared incredulously at his figure as he walked out until she could no longer see him. However, to prevent her from making any mistakes inside, the bathroom door was not closed. She shouted hoarsely and angrily at the door, Jingxian, you are so shameless. How is this fair for me? The feeling of being influenced by the drug is not something a normal person can bear. There was no response from outside. This time, Jinwan was really angry, but the increasingly turbulent feeling in her body left her with no strength to shout or be angry. However, just as she was quietly soaking in the water, she vaguely heard movement from the bedroom. The bathroom she was in was the private bathroom that Jingxian used to use, but at this time, the sound of water also came from the spare bathroom in the bedroom. While she was being tortured here, Jingxian was actually taking a bath? She must be crazy to think that when he first appeared in the hotel and took her away, she felt that he was almost surrounded by a godly halo. What AF * King Halo? After hearing the sound of water in the bathroom for a while, Jinwan closed her eyes. The clothes on her body were too uncomfortable, and she raised her hand to take off the gown, but she did not have the strength to do so. After raising her hand for a long time, she could only tug down the other shoulder strap and then lay weakly in the bathtub. The warm water on her burning skin was so comfortable that she could not help but moan. However, she wanted to save her face, so she could only bite her lips and not make a sound. Not long after the sound of water in the bathroom stopped, Jingxian came back wearing a set of soft gray home clothes. Jinwan finally opened her eyes. She stared blankly and hatefully at the man who was covered in the fragrance of shower gel. She then looked at his clean, short hair that did not need any styling and was already charming enough. She closed her eyes and turned her head away from him. She said reluctantly, "Can you help me take off my gown? It's stuck to my body with the water. It's too uncomfortable." And the man did not refuse. He responded and came over, helped her up from the bathtub, and easily unzipped the back of her gown. Because the gown was unzipped, her body loosened, and then the gown was taken off by the man. Jean Wan was wearing a set of nude underwear. Soaking in the water like this, there was no difference between wearing it and not wearing it. She did not look at the man's seemingly calm but darkening gaze. She turned her head away and hugged her chest in the warm water with her hands. "You're wearing your underwear like this. Do you need me to help you take it off?" Mo Jingshan stood by her bathtub like a gentleman. His low, husky voice carried a hint of patience. However, based on Jean Wan's understanding of him, this man was definitely not so kind. Otherwise, if he wanted to take it off, he would have done so earlier. Why did he need to ask her? He was just forcing her to take the initiative to ask him to help her. Jean Wan clutched her underwear and remained stubborn. "No need." Then wear it." The man stood up and sat by the bathtub. He watched her in the water, her body flushed seductively because of the drug. Her cheeks were also red and delicate, but she gritted her teeth and endured it. "Didn't you say you didn't want to see me in the bathtub? Why are you sitting here and looking at me?" The man's hand gently stirred the water in her bathtub, and when the water splashed onto her shoulder, her entire body trembled. She lowered her head to look at the man's fingers on the water, and for some reason, she yearned for this hand to touch her body. You're tuning into the Romantic Tales YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.